I scraped the dried remnants of somebody's potato salad into the garbage disposal, watching it swirl down in a slow beige spiral. 47 people had come to mourn my mother. 47 plates, 47 forks, 47 napkins crumpled into damp balls. I was the only one still counting. Emotion, one of
Tense faucet had a particular rhythm when set to its lowest flow, a thin, patient trickle that sounded almost like a metronome. I had listened to that rhythm for 20 years, through my father's stroke, through the months of physical therapy where I learned to lift a grown man from a wheelchair, through the slow, insulting decline of my mother's cognition when she began forgetting my name but never Daniel's. Emotion,
Through it all, this faucet had kept its tempo, and I had kept mine. I picked up another plate. A hairline crack ran across its face, bisecting the Ashford family crest that my mother had commissioned for the fine china when I was 9. She had been so proud of that crest, a pair of crossed oak leaves above a motto in bastardized Latin that none of us could properly translate. I had tried once at the dinner table, offering the correct translation I'd found in a library book. My mother had looked at me as though I'd tracked mud across the carpet. "It means what I say it means, Clara." That was Margaret Ashford in miniature. Reality was not something to be observed. It was something to be curated. I set the cracked plate aside. 20 years of service, and even the china was giving out before I was. The house was enormous around me. That was the word for it. Not large, not spacious, but enormous, in the way medieval churches are enormous, designed to make you feel the weight of something greater than yourself. The ceilings in the main hall rose to 14 feet. The staircase curved with deliberate grandeur, each step carpeted in a cream wool that my mother had replaced every 18 months, though no one visited often enough to wear it down. The library held 2,000 volumes arranged by color. Emotion. I had spent the afternoon weaving through rooms full of relatives who could not quite remember what I did for a living. "Are you still in design?" Aunt Helen had asked, her brow furrowed with the effort of feigning interest. "Architecture," I had said, and then corrected myself because it wasn't true anymore. "I was in architecture." I stopped. "Oh," she'd said, "that's right, you moved home." She said it the way you might say someone had moved to a smaller apartment, a natural downsizing, not a sacrifice.
Not the demolition of a career I had spent 7 years building, brick by careful brick, only to watch it dissolve in the bathwater of filial obligation. But I hadn't said that. I never said that. I plunged my hands back into the tepid water and found a wine glass hiding beneath the suds.
Tense, a faint crescent of burgundy lipstick clung to its rim. Whoever had drunk from this glass had been at the funeral to perform grief, not to feel it. I could tell because the lip print was perfect, unsmudged, applied fresh. You don't reapply lipstick if you've been crying. A fartageglas and the receipt. You don't reapply lipstick if you've been crying. The garbage disposal hummed and choked on a fragment of bone from the roasted chicken that someone, probably Cousin Martin's wife, who always brought the same aggressive rosemary chicken to every family function, had carved with surgical imprecision, leaving jagged shards in the meat. I turned off the disposal, reached in with bare fingers, and extracted the bone. It was still warm. I held it there for a moment, dripping, while the fluorescent light above the stove buzzed its single note. This was my inheritance, I thought. Not the house, not the land, not the investments or the antiques or the wine cellar that Daniel had already begun cataloging on his phone during the reception, scrolling through vintages with his thumb while our mother's casket was still warm in the ground. My inheritance was this, the cleanup. The labor no one saw because someone had to do it, and I was always the someone. Emotion. My phone vibrated on the counter. I dried my hands on a dishcloth that smelled of lavender and bleach, my mother's two acceptable scents, and picked it up. An email from the estate attorney, Richard Hale. I recognized the name because I was the one who had found him, vetted his credentials, driven my mother to his office when she could still walk, and later drove the documents to her bedside when she couldn't. Dear Miss Ashford, the email began. Please be advised that the reading of your mother's last will and testament has been scheduled for Thursday, April 24th at 10 a.m. at our offices. Both you and your brother, Mr. Daniel Ashford, are expected to attend. Both you and your brother. I read the line twice. There was something about the phrasing that sounded almost equitable, as though Daniel and I occupied parallel positions in our mother's world. Emotion. As though we had both carried equal weight. The thought was so absurd that I actually exhaled a sound, not quite a laugh, but something adjacent, a small pressurized burst of air from somewhere deep in my sternum. I set the phone down and looked at the kitchen. The counters were clean. The dishes were done. The casserole dishes were soaking. The trash was tied. Emotion. The lilies were wilting in their cellophane. No one had asked me to do any of this. No one ever asked. That was the entire mechanism, the silent gear that turned the Ashford machine. The assumption, the taken for granted gravity of Clara, always pulling, always holding things in orbit, while being entirely invisible herself. I folded the dishcloth into a precise rectangle and placed it over the faucet handle. My mother had taught me to do that. Emotion. One of the few things she had taught me that wasn't about disappearing. Upstairs, her bedroom door was closed. I could smell her perfume seeping through the crack at the bottom. Chanel No. 5, applied every morning even when she had stopped recognizing the bottle. Emotion. The hospice nurse had told me that scent memory was the last to go. My mother had forgotten my face, but she had never forgotten her signature fragrance. I did not go upstairs. Instead, I picked up my coat from the chair where I had draped it that morning, 10 hours ago, a lifetime ago, and pulled my car keys from the pocket. Emotion quickly. The brass keyring was cold and angular in my palm. I turned off the kitchen light. The copper pots caught the last glow from the hallway and held it suspended like small, obedient mirrors. I locked the door on my way out, testing the deadbolt twice because that was what I did. Emotion, I was the one who locked up. I was the one who checked. I was the one who made certain that everything was in its place. No one had ever done the same for me. Emotion. The drive home took 40 minutes. My apartment, a one-bedroom rental above a dry cleaner's on Maple Street, was dark when I arrived. There were no flowers, no casseroles, no cards with embossed condolences. The mailbox held a water bill and a coupon for carpet cleaning. Afsalen als nose afs. The mailbox held a water bill and a coupon for carpet cleaning. I sat in the car for a long time before going inside. The engine ticked as it cooled. Somewhere down the block, a porch light flickered in the wind. Thursday. The will reading. I would sit across from Daniel in Richard Hale's office, and I would learn what 20 years of sacrifice had been worth to a woman who could not remember my name. But what I did not yet know, what I could not have known as I sat in that dark car with the water bill in my lap and the ghost of my mother's perfume still clinging to my hair, was that Margaret Ashford's last will and testament would not contain my name at all, not once. A Mosin. Not anywhere. as if I had never existed, as if I had been erased from the very family I had held together with my bare, dishwater wrinkled hands. Tense Clara, your father's had a stroke. My mother's voice over the phone had been flawlessly composed, the same tone she used to announce dinner parties and dental appointments. It was the last time anyone would ever need to call me at my office, because after I hung up, I never went back. That had been 17 years ago. I was 31. I had just been promoted to associate at Whitfield and Chambers, the kind of firm that designed community libraries and courthouses and buildings that mattered, structures built to hold something larger than the people inside them. My desk had overlooked the New Haven harbor, where the salt air would curl through the cracked window and settle on my blueprints like weather. I had a drafting table with a brass lamp my mentor had given me, engraved with the words, "Build what lasts." The lamp had a green glass shade that cast everything in the warm, particular glow of focused work. I left it there when I drove to Connecticut that Tuesday, thinking I would be back by Friday. Friday turned into the following Monday. Monday turned into a leave of absence. The leave of absence turned into a resignation letter I wrote at 3 a.m. at the kitchen table of the Ashford house, while my father slept upstairs in a hospital bed that I had rented, assembled and positioned by the window so he could see the garden. The pen scratched against the paper, a physical letter, because my mother believed emails were for tradespeople. The ink bled slightly where my hand pressed too hard, blurring the word regretfully until it looked like it had been written underwater. Daniel had called twice during those first weeks, both times from airports. "How's Dad doing?" he'd ask, and I could hear the gate announcements behind him, the efficient, impersonal voice directing passengers to boarding, the low rumble of wheeled luggage across tile. Daniel was always going somewhere. He had the gift of forward motion, the blessed inability to stay still long enough for obligation to catch him. "He's stable," I'd said. "Physical therapy starts tomorrow." "Great, you're amazing, Clara. I don't know what we'd do without you." "We?" As if he had been doing anything at all. I drove to Richard Hale's office the morning of the will reading with the window cracked 2 inches, letting the April air slide across my face in thin, damp ribbons that smelled of thawing soil and the faintly metallic scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. The trees along the highway were just beginning to flush green, that tentative, almost apologetic shade of early spring, as if the leaves weren't quite sure they were allowed to come back. I understood the feeling. The route took me through downtown, past the old brick buildings with their limestone cornices and arched windows. I used to sketch buildings like these in my college notebooks. The way the brick header courses created rhythm, the proportion of window to wall, the negative space between the cornice brackets. Architecture had its own grammar, and I had been fluent. Now I drove past them the way you drive past a language school after you've forgotten the language, with a dull phantom ache in the jaw, as if the words were still trapped there, calcified against the palate. Richard Hale's office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian on Church Street. The staircase groaned under my weight, not from any flaw, but from the particular resignation of old wood that has carried too many people to appointments they dreaded. The waiting room smelled of leather, lemon oil, and paper, honest, old-fashioned smells that had nothing to do with the digital world Daniel inhabited. A grandfather clock ticked in the corner with the heavy, judicial patience of a metronome. When I arrived at 9:47, the receptionist offered me coffee in a ceramic mug, not a paper cup. I said yes. I always said yes. Daniel was not there. I sat in one of the high-backed chairs and wrapped both hands around the mug. The coffee was dark and slightly bitter, and the heat seeped into my fingers, which I realized only then had been cold since the funeral. I drank it slowly, watching the clock. At 10:03, my phone buzzed. Running a few behind. 10 minutes. Don't start without me. Sen. The emoji. Even now, Daniel punctuated his lateness with charm. The smiley face was his ambassador, sent ahead to do the work of apology so he wouldn't have to. I showed the text to the receptionist, who smiled in a way that told me this was not the first time she had witnessed the choreography of entitled tardiness. At 10:11, Daniel walked in. He was wearing a pale blue linen shirt, the top button undone, sleeves rolled to the forearm in that calculated casualness that magazines call effortless. There was nothing effortless about Daniel. Every detail was a performance: the linen, the Cartier, the faint tan that meant he'd been somewhere warm while I had been managing our mother's hospice schedule in a drafty Connecticut winter, layering blankets over her legs while the radiator clanked its complaints. Clara. He said my name the way people say hello to a receptionist, acknowledging, not engaging. Then he hugged me, a brief compression of his chest against mine that lasted exactly 2 seconds. I counted. He smelled of sandalwood and something commercially oceanic, the cologne equivalent of a hotel lobby. "How are you holding up?" he asked, but he was already looking over my shoulder at the hallway, calculating the layout, orienting himself in a space he'd never bothered to visit during the 11 times I had driven our mother here. "I'm here," I said. Richard Hale appeared in the doorway. He was a man built for rooms like this, tall, gray at the temples, with the kind of rectangular glasses that signal competence and restraint. He shook Daniel's hand first. Of course he did. Daniel was the one with the handshake, the eye contact, the wattage. "Shall we?" Hale said, and led us down the hall. The conference room had a mahogany table long enough for 8, polished to the gloss of still water. Daniel and I sat across from each other. Between us, 2 copies of a document face down on the wood, 2 glasses of water beating condensation onto stone coasters, and a silence that felt less like absence and more like something with weight, a held breath, heavy and full. Hale opened a folder. The paper rustled like dry leaves. "This is the last will and testament of Margaret Eloise Ashford," he said, "executed and notarized on October 3rd of last year. October, 6 months before she died. I tried to remember October. My mother had still been lucid, some days. She had still recognized me, some days, but her grip on names had been loosening, and more than once I had caught her calling me by my grandmother's name, or no name at all. I'll read the relevant dispositive sections," Hale continued. He put on his glasses. His voice shifted into a lower register, careful and measured, the voice of a man who understood that the words he was about to speak would rearrange the architecture of other people's lives. Daniel crossed his ankle over his knee and folded his hands in his lap. He looked as though he were waiting for a restaurant check, mildly interested, not remotely uncertain. I placed my hands flat on the table. My palms left 2 faint fog marks on the mahogany. The grandfather clock in the waiting room was still audible through the closed door, that slow, metronomic authority measuring out whatever time I had left as a woman who believed her mother had loved her equally. Hale began to read. I heard Daniel's name, then I heard it again. The estate to Daniel, the investment portfolio to Daniel, the art collection to Daniel. Hale's voice moved through the clauses with the rhythm of a liturgy, and each sentence laid another brick into a wall I could feel rising between me and everything I had believed about my place in this family. I waited for the turn, the paragraph that would begin with my name, the section that would acknowledge 20 years of crushed blueprints and cold hospital rooms and drives at 2 in the morning when she couldn't remember where she was. Hale turned to the final page. He paused, a small, almost imperceptible hesitation in a man whose profession was built on never hesitating, and I felt the floor shift beneath my chair, not literally, but something foundational, something load-bearing, cracked silently inside the structure of who I thought I was. Because I understood, in that pause, before Hale said a single word more, that the turn was not coming. Emotion, that there was no paragraph, that Margaret Ashford's final act of curation had been to arrange the architecture of her death the same way she had arranged her life, with Clara nowhere in the frame. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when the world confirms something you always suspected but never allowed yourself to believe. It doesn't roar, it doesn't crash, It arrives like local anesthesia, a slow numbness that starts at the edges and works its way in until you cannot feel the thing that is cutting you. Richard Hale finished reading my mother's will at 10:34 in the morning. I know the time because I was staring at the brass ship's clock on his wall, Roman numerals, an anchor etched into the face, and I had been staring at it since somewhere around the third paragraph, when I realized my name was not going to appear. The second hand moved in small, decisive jerks, each one a tiny guillotine dropping on the next fraction of a minute. The estate. The house on Winding Ridge Road with its 14-foot ceilings and its library arranged by color, and the kitchen I had scrubbed 2 nights ago. The smell of lemon oil still embedded in the creases of my knuckles. The house where I had spent 17 years changing sheets that smelled of illness and lavender, administering medications that left a chemical residue on my fingertips, driving to pharmacies at midnight because my mother's pain would not observe business hours. That house, every room, every fixture, every inch of the garden where my father had once shown me how to prune roses, the scent of damp mulch rising between us as he guided my hands around the shears, went to Daniel, the investment portfolio, $3.2 million. My mother had never mentioned it, not in all the years I balanced her checkbook with a pencil worn to a stub, filed her taxes while the radiator clicked its Morse code of complaint, argued with her insurance company while she sat in the next room, the television's blue light washing over her face like water over stone. To Daniel, the art collection, the antiques, the silver service that had belonged to my grandmother, the grandmother whose name my mother had started calling me in those last months, her voice thin as tissue paper. All of it to Daniel. I sat very still. The leather of the chair creaked once beneath me, a small, involuntary protest from the furniture that I could not make myself. My fingertips had gone white from pressing against the mahogany, the wood's dark grain intricate beneath my skin, like lines on a topographic map of terrain I would never be allowed to cross. Hale removed his glasses with the care of a man putting away a surgical instrument after a procedure he wished he hadn't performed. "That concludes the dispositive sections," he said. I waited for the addendum, the codicil. Surely there was a sealed envelope with my name on it. Something Margaret had tucked into the file because she couldn't bear to put softer feelings into legal language. The air conditioning pushed the scent of leather and old paper through the room in slow, invisible currents. Hale looked at me, not at Daniel, at me. And in his expression, I found the answer. A slight contraction around his eyes, the involuntary flinch of a professional who has delivered a wound and lacks the authority to bandage it. No envelope, no codicil, no addendum. Daniel shifted, his linen sleeve rustling against the armrest. He was processing, not guilt, I realized. Logistics. His mind was a spreadsheet. Mine was a ruin. I didn't know the specifics, he said, running his thumb along the table edge. This is the first I'm hearing the actual details. With weakest lie he had ever told. He had visited our mother 3 times in her final year, each visit one weekend. Each time, I noticed him emerging from her bedroom with the expression of a man checking that a promise still held. "Clara," his voice found the register of tenderness, a practiced key change. "This doesn't change anything between us. We're family. Whatever Mom decided, we can work something out." Work something out. He said it the way a landlord offers to negotiate rent with a tenant he's already decided to evict. And I understood, with the clarity of a woman who has watched her entire history be reorganized without her consent, that Daniel would take every last silver fork, every stock certificate, every square foot of the house where I had worn grooves into the hardwood from pacing during my father's therapy sessions. He would do it with the same boyish smile he'd worn when he walked in late this morning. I said nothing. A single drop of condensation slid down my water glass and stopped, suspended on the curve, gathering weight. Hale cleared his throat. "Miss Alkung." "Ashford, you are welcome to retain your own counsel. There are legal avenues." "Thank you," I said. My voice came out level, like the floor of a building gutted but whose facade still stands. I picked up the will, 7 pages, the paper faintly warm from the printer, absurdly light for something that had just demolished 20 years of my life, and placed it in my bag. In the parking lot, Daniel caught up to me. The asphalt was warm under my flats, softened by April sun, releasing its slow petroleum sweetness. Clara, wait. I stopped, not because he asked, because the car was in front of me and my keys were already in my hand, the brass teeth biting into my palm. I'm going to call you tonight, he said, the sun behind him turning his linen translucent. We'll figure this out, I promise. He touched my arm, 2 fingers, the precise amount of contact required to simulate caring without committing to it. I got in the car. The interior was baked and close, tasting of heated vinyl. The engine caught with a sound like a small, reliable heart. I did not cry, but as I pulled onto Church Street, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, one eye and a strip of cheekbone, and what I saw there was not grief. Not acceptance, not the face of a woman who had been erased and would stay erased. It was the face of a woman doing arithmetic, because somewhere between the 3rd clause and the 7th page, a different part of my brain had woken up, the part that used to read blueprints. The part that could look at a structure and see not what it was, but where it was weakest, where the joints were overstressed, where the foundation had been poured too thin, where a single, precisely placed question could bring the entire edifice down. My mother had built her final act with the confidence of someone who believed no one would challenge it. She had forgotten that she raised an architect. The thing about being hollowed out is that it makes you lighter. I felt it as I walked across that parking lot. A strange, weightless clarity, like the first breath after being pulled from deep water. Everything I had believed about my family had been stripped away in 7 pages, and what remained was not grief, not yet. What remained was space, a vast, humming emptiness where the story of myself as a loved daughter used to live. Daniel caught up to me before I reached the car. I heard his loafers clicking on the asphalt, that particular staccato of Italian leather on warm, tar-softened pavement, the sound of money moving quickly in pursuit of something it assumed it still owned. Clara, just hold on a second. I stopped, not because he asked, because my keys were tangled in the silk lining of my bag, and my fingers were trembling in a way that had nothing to do with cold. The brass teeth of the key snagged against the fabric, and I worked it free while Daniel positioned himself between me and the driver's door, with the practiced ease of someone who had always stood between other people and their exits. Listen, he said. He put one hand on the roof of my car, my rusted 10-year-old Camry with its cracked dashboard and passenger seat buried under pharmacy bags and folded hospice brochures I hadn't been able to throw away, and leaned in with an intimacy that looked from any distance like brotherhood. Up close, it was containment. I could smell his cologne, sandalwood laid over something sharply citric, the kind of scent designed to make you feel like you were the only person in the room. I know this is a lot to process, a lot to process. I repeated the words back to him, and they tasted like chalk, dry, powdery, the residue of something institutional. Daniel, she left me nothing. The word nothing landed between us like a dropped glass. I heard it shatter in the silence that followed, not literally, but in the way Daniel's jaw tightened a fraction. The reflexive clench of a man hearing a truth he had spent months insulating himself against. She left things the way she thought was best. Mom always had her ideas about how things should go. Her ideas about how things should go left me with a 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner's and 17 years of unpaid labor. My voice cracked on the word labor, not from weakness, but from the effort of compressing 2 decades of swallowed fury into a single sentence. I could feel it in my sternum, the physical weight of all the things I had never said, pressing upward against my ribs like steam in a sealed pipe. Daniel's expression shifted. The corners of his mouth tightened, the first fracture in the composed facade. He was used to Clara the accommodator, Clara who rescheduled her life around other people's emergencies, Clara who said, "I'm fine with the regularity of a metronome." This was not that Clara. "I hear you," he said, "and I want you to know I'm going to make this right. We'll sit down, you and me, and figure out something fair. Fair." The word hung between us like smoke from a building neither of us wanted to admit was already burning. Fair, in Daniel's vocabulary, had always meant an arrangement where he came out ahead but could claim the moral high ground. Fair was the rent he never paid, and the family dinner he attended once a year with a bottle of wine that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The corks pop his only contribution to the meal I had spent 8 hours preparing. "What does fair look like to you, Daniel?" He blinked. No one had ever asked him to define his terms. A warm breeze pushed through the parking lot, carrying the sickly sweet perfume of the Bradford pear blossoms that line the property, those ornamental trees that every suburb plants for beauty and that anyone who knows structure will tell you are designed to split. "We can talk about that. Tonight. I'll call you. You haven't called me in 4 months." Something behind his eyes went flat, not angry, calculated, the machinery recalibrating. He ran his hand through his hair, the sandy brown sweep falling perfectly back into place like trained silk, and he withdrew his hand from my car roof. "I'm going to call you," he said. The promise had hardened into assertion. He walked to his Audi. The door opened with a sealed, pressurized whisper, the kind of engineered silence that costs $60,000. Through his windshield, I watched him check his phone before starting the engine. Not after, before. I sat in my car for 4 minutes before turning the key. The vinyl seat was hot against my back, pressing heat through my blouse like an iron. The air inside tasted of dust and the synthetic vanilla of a faded air freshener, a pale, apologetic ghost of sweetness hanging from the mirror. My hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the way my father had taught me, and I held on because holding was what I knew how to do. The drive home took the long route, through residential streets where colonial houses sat behind hedgerows as tall as ambition. Emotion. These were houses I might have designed in another life, houses with good bones and intentional proportions. I drove past them slowly, the tires whispering on smooth pavement, and I felt the double weight of what I had lost. Not just a past, but a future that had been amputated 17 years ago and never properly mourned. My apartment above Prestige dry cleaners smelled of perchloroethylene, that sharp chemical sweetness that Mr. Park swore was harmless, but that I could taste on the back of my tongue, metallic and persistent, every time I climbed the narrow stairs. Inside, 4 rooms of rented furniture, bare walls, a refrigerator humming its single indifferent note. I had moved here 3 years ago, after selling my condominium to pay the medical bills insurance declined. Temporary, I had told myself. 3 years later, the temporary had calcified into permanence, the way grief hardens into personality if you leave it long enough. I set the will on the kitchen table, 7 pages under the overhead light, the staple winking in the corner. Daniel did not call that night. He did not call the next night either. I sat with that silence the way you sit with a fever, waiting for it to break, knowing it won't, knowing the waiting itself is the illness. By the second night, I had stopped checking my phone. By the third, I had started reading the will with a mechanical pencil, the same kind I once used for architectural drawings, underlining passages, filling 3 pages of a legal pad with notes, dates, numbers that didn't add up, inconsistencies that a grieving daughter might miss, but that an architect, trained to see where the structure deviated from the plan, would catch in her sleep. On the 4th morning, I dressed in something other than grief, Clean blouse, navy slacks, my mother's gold watch, cool and precise on my left wrist. Not sentimentality, but inventory. I was wearing a piece of the estate that Margaret had forgotten to catalog, and there was a bitter satisfaction in that small accidental inheritance. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and saw, for the first time in years, the outline of the woman I had been before I disappeared. Then I picked up the phone and called the only person I trusted to tell me the truth without decorating it. Elena Voss answered on the second ring. "Clara," she said, and in that single word, clipped, warm, immediate, I heard something I had not heard from anyone in my family in 20 years. Recognition. The attic smelled the way old secrets smell, cedar and mothballs, and the particular pressing stillness of air that hasn't moved in years. I climbed the pull-down ladder with the flashlight from the kitchen junk drawer, its beam cutting through the dust motes like a surgeon's light, illuminating things that had been deliberately stored in darkness. I had come to the house to collect personal belongings. That was the reason I had rehearsed in the car. Practical, contained, the kind of errand even Daniel couldn't object to. But the truth was heavier than that. I needed to walk through these rooms one more time before whatever version of Daniel's life he was planning to install here erased the traces of mine. The foyer had already started to change. A contractor's van, prestige moving and storage, the lettering straining for dignity, sat in the driveway. Inside, 2 men were measuring the library shelves, not for books, for speakers. Daniel was converting the library into a home theater. 2,000 volumes, arranged by color, about to be replaced by a sound system and a leather sectional. I walked past them without speaking. They didn't ask who I was. I was a woman in sensible flats carrying a cardboard box. I was furniture. Upstairs, I turned the corner toward my childhood bedroom. I stopped. The door was open, and inside, where a twin bed with a lavender quilt and a bookshelf of architecture textbooks had once stood, there was a glass desk, a standing lamp with a chrome finish, and a framed photograph of Daniel shaking hands with someone important at a conference. The carpet had been replaced with hardwood. The closet doors had been removed, revealing built-in shelving that held nothing but a row of identical moleskin notebooks and a charging dock. My room was gone. Not just changed, gone. Overwritten with such efficiency that there was no trace of the girl who had once lain on that lavender quilt with a protractor, calculating the angle of afternoon light through the window because she thought that someday she would design buildings that captured it. I stood in the doorway and held the cardboard box against my hip, and something inside me shifted, not broke, because the breaking had already happened in Hale's office. Something rearranged. The grief compacted itself into a harder, denser substance, like coal under pressure beginning its long conversion into something that could cut glass. There was nothing to collect from this room. There had never been anything left for me in this room. I closed the door with a click that sounded like a period at the end of a very long sentence. The attic. I had not been up here in years. My mother considered the attic a failure of organization, a space where things went when she did not want to see them but could not bring herself to destroy them. Christmas decorations from the 1990s. My father's golf bag, the leather grip cracked and chalky. Boxes labeled in my mother's precise handwriting, kitchen, do not open, and Victor Misk and old albums. I moved through the clutter with the flashlight, ducking under a crossbeam that smelled of old pine sap, its surface rough with age. The floorboards creaked in a pattern I almost recognized. The same rhythm as the staircase in Hale's office, the same exhausted protest of wood that had borne too much weight for too long. In the far corner, behind a stack of wardrobe boxes draped in yellowed sheets, I found it. A steel filing cabinet. Olive green, 2 drawers, the kind of utilitarian object that would have offended my mother's aesthetic sensibility if she had known it was here, which meant, I realized, that she hadn't. This had been hidden. This was Victor's. The lock was small and stubborn, a keyhole no wider than a pencil lead. I pulled the handle, locked. I sat back on my heels and looked at it. The dust on its surface was thick and undisturbed, a decade's worth, maybe more. No one had opened this since my father died, perhaps long before that. The metal was cold under my fingertips, even in the attic's stale warmth, and I could smell the faint iron tang of old steel, the particular scent of things built to last by men who did not trust institutions to protect what mattered. The key, emotion. If there was a key, it would be in Victor's workshop. My father had been a methodical man, quiet, principled, as precise in his small rebellions as my mother was in her large ones. He kept tools on labeled hooks, wrote dates on the handles of paintbrushes, stored screws by gauge in baby food jars with typed labels. If he had locked something, the key would be within reach, within his reach, within the private sovereignty of the only room in this house that Margaret had never bothered to curate. The workshop was in the detached garage, a space that smelled of sawdust and pipe tobacco and linseed oil, scents that hit me with the force of a hand on the shoulder. I stood in the doorway and breathed. My father's workbench was exactly as he had left it 3 years ago, a scarred maple surface covered in pencil marks and ring stains from coffee mugs, the wood worn smooth in the center where his forearms had rested for decades. His planes and chisels hung on a pegboard in order of size, each one outlined in black marker like a body at a crime scene. I began at the left side, moved systematically. My father's precision was genetic. I could feel it in my hands as I checked behind tools, inside jars, under the shallow drawers built into the bench. In the third drawer, beneath a coil of picture wire and a tin of furniture wax, I found a small envelope. On the front, in my father's deliberate engineer's handwriting, for the cabinet. Inside, a brass key, no larger than my thumbnail. It had gone green at the edges, oxidized from years in a dark drawer, but the teeth were sharp and defined. I held it up to the light from the garage window. The metal caught the late afternoon sun and threw a speck of gold onto the wall, a tiny fleeting signal from a man who had died 3 years ago, but had, it seemed, left something behind. Not for anyone, for me. I closed my fist around the key. The brass warmed instantly against my skin, the specific, startling warmth of metal that has been waiting in the cold to be held. I did not go back to the attic that day. The key went into the pocket of my navy slacks, pressed against my thigh where I could feel its weight, small, specific, undeniable, with every step on the way back to my car. The contractors did not look up as I passed. I drove home with both hands on the wheel and the key in my pocket, and a question forming in the back of my mind that I would not be able to silence. What did Victor Ashford think was important enough to lock away from the woman who curated everything? And why had he made sure I, the invisible daughter, the one who stayed, was the only one who would know where to look? Emotion? The brass key turned in the lock with a sound like a knuckle cracking, a small, deliberate release of something that had been held tight for too long. The filing cabinet drawer slid open on rust-stiffened rollers, exhaling a breath of old paper and iron, and the smell hit me the way a photograph hits you, not with information, but with the physical presence of a moment you had forgotten. I had brought the cabinet home. This had required ingenuity. The steel box weighed more than expected. Victor had built things to last, even his secrets, and I had to wrap it in a moving blanket from the trunk of my car and carry it down the attic ladder, one vertebra compressing step at a time. The metal edge cutting into my forearms through the fabric. The contractors hadn't noticed. They were busy converting my family's history into Daniel's lifestyle, and a woman carrying a blanket-wrapped box was invisible in the same way I had always been. By design. Now it sat on my kitchen table, this olive green monument to my father's private life, and the drawer was open, and inside were things that Victor Ashford had apparently spent years assembling in silence. The top hanging file was labeled financial. Inside, bank statements, not the joint accounts I had managed for my mother, but a separate savings account at a bank in New Haven opened in Victor's name alone. Monthly deposits, small but consistent, going back 15 years. The balance at his last statement, $47,322. A modest fortune built in increments so careful they were nearly invisible. 500 here, 300 there, skimmed from a life spent in the shadow of a woman who audited every expenditure like a customs officer inspecting luggage. Beneath the financial file, insurance documents. A life insurance policy listing me, Clara Ashford, as sole beneficiary, not Margaret, not Daniel, me. The policy had been taken out 12 years ago and maintained through automatic withdrawals from the secret account. The premiums were current. Victor had paid them from beyond the grave through 3 years of pre-funded automatic transfers, as if he had known or feared that his death would not be the end of what needed protecting. My hands were trembling, not from cold, from the particular destabilizing shock of discovering that you had been loved with precision by someone you thought had loved you only with passivity. The second drawer held loose papers, letters mostly, some in envelopes, some loose, all in my father's block letter handwriting. I picked up the first and unfolded it. The paper was soft from age, the ink faded from blue to something closer to the color of a bruise. "Dear Clara," it began. "I'm writing this because I cannot say it, and because your mother would not allow me to say it, and because the walls of this house have learned to listen for disloyalty the way a dog learns to listen for its leash." I set the letter down, picked it up again. My breath came in shallow, measured pulls, not hyperventilation, but its controlled cousin, the careful breathing of someone who knows they are about to read something that will rearrange the furniture of their understanding. "You were always the strong one." Your mother said it as a compliment, but I knew, and you knew, that it was a sentence. The strong one does not need help. The strong one does not need recognition. The strong one is the pillar that holds everything up and that nobody thinks to thank, because pillars are not people. They are infrastructure. I read that line again, infrastructure. My father had found the word for what I was, not a person in this family, but a structural element, load-bearing, essential, invisible. The letter continued for 3 pages. He described, in the slow and careful prose of a man writing at a workbench by lamplight, the ways in which he had watched Margaret systematically elevate Daniel and diminish me. He catalogued the moments, the Christmas when Daniel received a car and I received a cardigan, the graduation where Margaret attended Daniel's ceremony in person and watched mine via a video call she ended early because she needed to set the table for Daniel's celebration dinner. The afternoon Victor had suggested gently that perhaps Clara's architecture career was worth preserving, and Margaret had turned to him with those pale blue eyes and said, with the quiet authority of a woman who had never been contradicted, "Clara's career is a hobby. Daniel's future is our legacy." "I should have fought harder," the letter said. "I should have fought at all. But your mother was the architect of this family, Clara, and I was only the man who built the birdhouses. I did not have the blueprints. I did not have the authority. All I had was the key to a filing cabinet." I pressed my palms flat against the table. The kitchen light buzzed overhead, that same indifferent fluorescent hum, and the dry cleaner's machines had gone silent for the night, leaving me alone with my father's voice for the first time since the morning he died. Beneath the letters, at the very bottom of the drawer, was a manila folder. It was thicker than the others, bound with a red rubber band that had dried and cracked but still held. On the tab, in block letters, A for Clara, "When the time comes." I removed the rubber band. It broke in my fingers, surrendering with a dry snap like a small twig underfoot. Inside, a document, a motion, typed, not handwritten, legal language, paragraphs dense with the vocabulary of trusts and fiduciary obligations and irrevocable provisions, and at the top, in serif font, Declaration of Trust, Victor H. Ashford, grantor. Deign a trust, my father had created a trust. I scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. The language was clinical, but the intent was incandescent. Victor had placed his personal savings, his life insurance policy, and I read this line 3 times, my pulse thickening in my ears, his 50% share of the Ashford family property into an irrevocable trust. Sole beneficiary, Clara Margaret Ashford. Sole beneficiary. The room tilted. Not literally, the walls stayed where they were, the table held its ground, but something inside me listed hard to port, the way a ship lists when it discovers it has been carrying ballast in the wrong hold. Everything I had assumed about my position in this family, disinherited, erased, abandoned by both parents, was wrong. One of them had been working silently and methodically to ensure that the erasure would not hold. I sat for a long time in the quiet of my kitchen, the trust documents spread before me like a map of territory I had not known existed. The clock on the microwave read 1:14 a.m. The overhead light buzzed. A car passed on Maple Street, its tires hissing on the wet pavement, and then silence again. Victor Ashford had spent the last decade of his life building something, not a birdhouse, not a bookshelf, but a legal structure designed to survive his wife's curation. He had done it in secret, in the only room she never entered, with tools she would not have recognized, a pen, a notary stamp, and the quiet conviction that his daughter deserved more than infrastructure. I folded the trust document and placed it back in the folder, placed the folder in my bag, zipped the bag shut. Then I picked up my phone and texted Elena, "Can you meet me tomorrow? I found something that changes everything." The reply came in 19 seconds. "Name the time and place. I'll clear the morning." I had known Elena Voss for 30 years. Since the semester, she had argued with a constitutional law professor so fiercely that campus security was called. And in all that time, I had never seen her pause the way she paused when she read my father's letter. She sat at her conference table on the 10th floor of Voss and Associates, her angular designer frames pushed up into her platinum-streaked hair, and she read Victor's words with her fingertip tracing each line. The morning light fell through the floor-to-ceiling windows in clean surgical sheets, and the espresso on her desk cooled untouched, the rich, oily scent of it thickening as the steam died, mixing with the beeswax polish of the walnut conference table. Elena did not let coffee cool. Elena did not let anything cool, but when she reached the paragraph about the Christmas when Daniel received a car and I received a cardigan, she set the letter down and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose. I watched her throat work, a single visible swallow, and I understood that what she was feeling was not surprise. It was recognition. Elena had been through her own version of this, a marriage to a man who had treated her contributions as background noise until she built a practice loud enough to drown him out. She knew the texture of this particular grief, the slow, suffocating accumulation of being undervalued, not through cruelty, but through indifference. "Clara," she said, and her voice had lost its usual prosecutorial edge, "do you understand what this is? A trust, an irrevocable trust." She tapped the document with one lacquered fingernail, emerald green, the click of keratin on paper, sharp as a gavel strike. "Your father created an irrevocable trust 12 years ago, named you sole beneficiary, funded with his 50% ownership stake in the Ashford family property. I had expected to feel triumph. I didn't. What I felt was the particular hollowing ache of being loved by someone who was too afraid to show it in the light, who had to hide his devotion in a filing cabinet behind a locked drawer because the woman he married would have destroyed it. My father had loved me with the desperation of a man smuggling medicine across a border, quietly, illegally, because the system he lived in had made love for his daughter a contraband. The house, I said. My voice came out thinner than I wanted. The house, the land, any structures, and the mineral rights, his half transferred to you upon his death. Irrevocable, meaning your mother couldn't have voided it even if she'd known. She didn't know. Elena looked at me over the conveyance form, yellow with age, its edges soft as cloth. Are you certain? Margaret Ashford would not have tolerated a secret trust, any more than she would have tolerated a stain on the tablecloth. I'm certain. Elena stood and walked to the window, her heels clicking against the marble floor in sharp detonations. Below, the city spread in glass and steel. Your mother's will gives everything to Daniel, but she could only dispose of what she owned. Victor transferred his 50% to you, so Margaret gave Daniel her half, not the whole. Daniel doesn't own the house. Daniel owns half, you own the other half, and he doesn't know it. The air conditioning hummed. I pressed my palms against the cool leather of the chair and tried to feel my hands. My fingers were numb, not from cold, but from the physical manifestation of emotional overload, the way the body shuts down peripheral sensation when the central processing unit is overwhelmed. I thought of my father sitting at his workbench, writing that letter by lamplight, his calloused hands guiding the pen with the same care he used to guide mine around the rose shears. The thought made something in my chest crack open like a split board, not breaking exactly, but separating along the grain, the way wood fails when the stress is applied slowly over years. There's more. I pulled out the bank statements, almost 50,000 in savings, and a life insurance policy naming me. Elena spread them across the table, each document in its own quadrant. Her gold statement earrings swayed as she bent, catching light in geometric bursts. The smell of old cellulose rose between us, indistinguishable from the smell of time itself. She read for 7 minutes, then she put on her glasses, the transformation immediate, operational, her eyes becoming instruments of measurement, and said, "This is going to be a war. Daniel will come at you with everything. Legal, emotional, familial. He will try to invalidate the trust. He will claim capacity issues. He will turn relatives against you. He will make this so expensive and painful that you give up." I thought about giving up. I thought about it the way I had thought about it every morning for 17 years, standing at my mother's kitchen sink, washing dishes that weren't mine, in a house I maintained but did not own, for a family that needed me the way a building needs its foundation, essentially, invisibly, and without gratitude. Emotion. I know what he is, I said. I've known for 20 years. Then here's what I need from you. She opened her laptop. The screen illuminated her face from below, casting her cheekbones in sharp relief. She pulled out a legal pad, yellow, ruled, smelling of wood pulp, and wrote at the top, "Ashford. Tell me everything, every sacrifice, every slight, every cent you spent, and every cent Daniel didn't. I want a timeline that could serve as a structural blueprint." So I told her. I told her about the architecture career I'd abandoned, the drafting table with the brass lamp, the harbor view, the word regretfully blurred by ink on a resignation letter written at 3 in the morning, about selling my condominium to cover medical bills, about Daniel's airport calls, about my mother's pale blue eyes that reserved their warmth for the child who never earned it and withheld it from the one who earned nothing else. I told her things I had never told anyone, not because they were secrets, but because no one had ever asked. The night I found my father on the bathroom floor, alone, because Daniel hadn't returned a single call, The afternoon, I missed the deadline for a design competition that would have changed my career because my mother needed to be driven to a specialist 200 miles away. The Thanksgiving when Daniel brought a girlfriend I'd never met, and my mother set an extra place at the table for her but asked me to eat in the kitchen because there weren't enough chairs. Elena wrote everything down, her handwriting dark and precise, like the lines in an architectural section drawing, the kind that shows what a building looks like when you cut it open. At 11:47, she set her pen down. Her expression was one I had seen exactly once before, in court, the moment she realized she was going to win a case everyone said was unwinnable. "They're going to call you greedy," she said. I looked at the timeline of my life cataloged in ink on Elena's legal pad. 20 years. I should have wept. Instead, I felt something harder than tears forming behind my eyes. Something mineral and dense, like the first crystal forming in a supersaturated solution. "Elena," I said, "I've been invisible my entire adult life. Being called names would be an upgrade." She reached across the table and closed her hand over mine. Her grip was warm and dry and irrefutable. "Then let's build your case, brick by careful brick." There is a particular cruelty to watching someone celebrate what they have taken from you. Not the sharp cruelty of a slap or an insult. Those leave marks you can photograph, evidence you can present. This cruelty is architectural. It surrounds you on all sides. It hums with laughter and clinking glasses, and it expects you to admire the view. Daniel's party was not called a housewarming. It was called a celebration of life for Margaret. The invitation, which I received by group text, not personal call, used the word gathering and the phrase in loving memory. But the caterers were wearing black tie, the champagne was Veuve Clicquot, and the jazz trio in the garden was playing Coltrane, not hymns. I arrived 40 minutes late, carrying a bottle of $12 Merlot from the gas station on Route 9. The label featured a cartoon fox, wearing a monocle. Absurd, defiant, the kind of wine you bring to a party where you are not really welcome but have decided to attend anyway. I held it against my hip and walked through the front door of the house where I had spent 17 years of my life. And the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was different. My mother's house had smelled of lemon oil and Chanel number 5 and the faintly medicinal undertone of a home where illness had stayed too long. Daniel's house, because that was what it was now, at least in his mind, smelled of imported cheese and lilies, and the particular engineered freshness of a space that had been professionally aired out. Not cleaned, erased. The scent of Margaret Ashford had been replaced the way you replace a light bulb, efficiently, without ceremony. The foyer was full of people I recognized, but who did not quite recognize me. Cousin Martin and his rosemary chicken wife. Aunt Helen in a silk blouse that rustled when she breathed. Uncle Stephen, who had flown in from Phoenix and who kept touching surfaces, the banister, the wainscoting, the edge of the hall table, as if he were appraising them for a future transaction. Daniel was in the living room holding court. He wore a cream linen blazer over a dark shirt, his Cartier catching the chandelier light, his smile distributed with the precision of a man who understood that charm was a currency that depreciated if not constantly circulated. People orbited him, drawn by the gravitational pull of a person who had just inherited a colonial mansion and $3.2 million and bore it all with the casual grace of someone who believed he deserved it. "Clara!" He spotted me from across the room and raised his glass. Champagne, naturally, the bubbles catching the light like tiny aspirational stars. "You made it." The emphasis on "made it" was slight but precise, as if my attendance had been a logistical achievement rather than a familial expectation. I crossed the room, my flat shoes silent on the hardwood floors I had polished quarterly for nearly 2 decades, and I submitted to the hug he offered, the same 2-second compression, the same sandalwood cologne, the same arm around my shoulder that functioned less as embrace and more as display. "Everyone, you remember my sister Clara." He set it to the room the way a museum guide introduces a lesser exhibit, informative, but with the implicit suggestion that the main collection was elsewhere. I smiled. I had learned to smile. It was one of the skills you developed when your primary function in a family was structural, load-bearing smiles, weight-distributing silences, the quiet competence of a woman who kept everything standing while no one looked up. I moved through the party like a visitor in my own history. The kitchen, where I had scrubbed 47 plates after the funeral, now featured a cheese board that someone had curated with the pretension of a magazine spread. Wedges of Gruyere and Comté arranged on a slate board with fig jam and crackers that probably cost more per ounce than the wine in my hand. I set my cartoon fox Merlot on the counter next to a row of bottles that cost 40 times as much and watched no one reach for it. In the garden, the jazz trio played beneath the pergola where my father had strung fairy lights the Christmas before his stroke. The rose beds were freshly mulched. Daniel had hired a landscaper, I realized, to maintain the garden my father had tended by hand. The mulch smelled of cedar and chemicals, nothing like the damp, living sweetness of the compost Victor used to spread with a pitchfork on Saturday mornings. Aunt Helen found me near the garden wall, standing with my back against the cool stone, the fox Merlot warming in my hand. "It's so good that Daniel is keeping the house in the family," she said, adjusting her scarf, a silk thing patterned with peacocks that probably cost as much as my monthly rent. "Margaret would have wanted that." "Margaret wanted a lot of things," I said. Helen blinked. The remark was a millimeter sharper than what she expected from me, and I watched her recalibrate. A small adjustment of the smile, a slight tilt of the head, the universal body language of someone who has decided to interpret honesty as bitterness. "Well, you know," she said, patting my arm, "Clara was always the strong one. You'll be fine." There it was, the sentence, the family liturgy recited with the reflexive ease of a prayer nobody believes in anymore. Clara was always the strong one. Translation: Clara does not need what Clara has earned, because Clara's strength is the excuse we use to take from her without guilt. I excused myself. In the hallway, I passed the library, now gutted, the bookshelves stripped, the 2,000 color-coded volumes boxed and stacked against the wall like evicted tenants. A large flat-screen television leaned against the fireplace mantel, still in its shipping plastic. Daniel's home theater. The space smelled of fresh drywall compound and sawdust, and I recognized the particular sting of a room being renovated by someone who understood nothing about what it had been. I stood there for a moment, looking at the boxes. Each one was labeled in the mover's handwriting: books, living room. No author, no subject. No indication that these volumes had been arranged by a woman who valued color over content, appearance over substance, and that this arrangement was in its own perverse way the most honest statement Margaret Ashford ever made about her priorities. Daniel appeared behind me. His reflection shimmered in the blank television screen, a dark outline against the hallway light. A motion that "I'm going to do something great with this room," he said. His voice was warm, confiding, as if he were letting me in on a secret. Full surround sound, maybe a bar in the corner. Dad loved this library. Dad read 3 books a year, Clara. He said it with a laugh. A generous, inclusive laugh, the kind that invited you to share in the dismissal of something you loved. The room deserves to be alive. I looked at the boxes, at the blank screen, at Daniel's reflection, dark and featureless against the light. "It was alive," I said. "You just never stayed long enough to notice." I left the library. I left the party. I drove home with my hands at 10 and 2, the Fox Merlot unopened on the passenger seat, and a cousin's whisper lodged in my chest like a splinter. Margaret always said Clara would be fine on her own. She's the strong one. The strong one. I parked outside Prestige Dry Cleaners and sat in the dark. The perchloroethylene seeped through the floorboards, that sharp chemical intimacy, and I breathed it in because it was mine. This smell, this apartment, this solitude that nobody had chosen but me. Then I called Elena. I went to his party, I said. He's already gutting the library. He's already erasing them both. A pause. Then Elena's voice, precise and furious. Good. Let him renovate. Let him knock down walls and install surround sound. Every change he makes to that property without your consent as co-owner is leverage, Clara. Every single nail he drives is a nail in his own case. I held the phone against my ear and felt something settle inside me. Not calm, exactly, but alignment. The way a building settles when its foundations finally accept the weight they were designed to carry. He doesn't know I own half, I said. Not yet, Elena said. And when he finds out, he's going to wish he'd read a few more of those books. I had been paying my parents' medical bills for 6 years. I knew this the way I knew the weight of a gallon of milk or the number of steps from my apartment door to the car, through repetition so constant it had become automatic, a line item in the budget of my erasure. What I had not known, what the bank statements spread across my kitchen table now made devastatingly clear, was that I had been paying bills that should have been covered by an account my brother had been quietly emptying. The table smelled of reheated coffee and the faintly metallic tang of old staples. I had been sitting here since 8 in the evening, and it was now past midnight, and the overhead fluorescent buzzed its single note, a frequency so familiar it had become the hum of my own thoughts, indistinguishable from silence. Victor's filing cabinet had not finished giving up its secrets. Beneath the trust document and the letters, in a folder labeled Margaret Finance Copies, I found a parallel archive, photocopies of Margaret's banking statements, their edges yellowed and soft as linen from years in the dark drawer. Carbon duplicates of checks that smelled faintly of the waxy pressure of old duplicating paper, the kind that left a faint violet residue on your fingertips when you rubbed the surface. And a handwritten ledger in my father's engineer's script, each digit formed with the same meticulous care he used when measuring dovetail joints, each line drawn with a metal ruler whose edge I could see imprinted faintly into the paper, like the ghost of a boundary. Daniel had been withdrawing money from Margaret's accounts since the year after Victor's stroke. The withdrawals were modest at first, 2,000, 1,500, always round numbers from the joint savings account at First Connecticut Bank. The early slips were accompanied by deposit records showing the same amounts entering Daniel's Manhattan account. No attempt at concealment, just a son reaching into his mother's purse with the entitlement of someone who believes proximity to wealth is the same as earning it. By year 3, the amounts had grown. 5,000, 8,000. A single withdrawal of 12,400, twice in 1 month, that corresponded, I realized, with a nausea that started in the tendons of my wrists and crawled upward like cold water filling a glove, to the exact date I had sold my condominium. The date was circled in Victor's ledger. He had pressed the pen so hard the ink had bled through to the next page, a small private hemorrhage of rage. I set the statement down. My fingers left damp ovals on the thermal paper, the nervous moisture of a woman discovering she had been robbed in slow motion over years in amounts calibrated to be just small enough that no alarm would sound. The thermal print was already fading where I had touched it, the numbers dissolving under the heat of my skin, as if the evidence were trying to destroy itself. But Victor had photocopied everything onto 20-pound bond, archival quality, the kind of paper used for blueprints meant to survive construction. He had known. I picked up the calculator from the kitchen drawer. A cheap solar-powered Casio, its plastic casing warm from hours in the closed dark, its buttons slightly tacky from years of kitchen grease. I began adding
Year 1, $14,200. Year 2, $23,800. Year 3, $41,500. Year 4, $38,000. Year 5, $52,700. Year 6, $47,300. Year 7, $29,600. The last year, the hospice year, the year the house smelled of antiseptic and morphine, and the slow fermenting sweetness of lilies left too long in their water, and I emptied bedpans and repositioned pillows and held our mother's hand through the 3 a.m. terrors while Daniel siphoned. Total $247,100. The green digits glowed on the calculator's display like the readout on a medical monitor, delivering a terminal diagnosis. $247,100. That was the amount Daniel had removed from our mother's accounts while I covered the gap with my own body, my condominium, my retirement, my savings, my career. Each year I had been the plug in a financial wound I didn't know existed, filling the hole Daniel carved with the only resource I had, myself. The worst part was that Margaret must have known. She managed her accounts with the same precision she managed her lipstick, her guest lists, her book arrangements. She would have noticed $52,000 disappearing the way she noticed a water ring on her mahogany table. She noticed, she allowed it, because Daniel was the investable asset and I was the operating cost, depreciating annually, never accruing value, written off. I pressed my forehead against the window. The glass was cool and gritty with the fine particulate of urban air, and my breath fogged it in slow, rhythmic blooms that collapsed back into the cold surface. Below, Maple Street lay in the dark of its broken streetlight, a strip of wet pavement reflecting nothing. I went back to the table, opened my laptop, the refurbished MacBook Air with its sticky A key, its fan whirring like a small concerned insect, and built a spreadsheet. Column A, date. Column B, amount withdrawn by Daniel.
Column C, amount I paid in medical bills. Column D, amount Daniel contributed. Column D was empty. 0 entries across 7 years. Not $1 toward the care of the parents whose entire estate he had inherited. He had extracted from the very accounts meant to fund their care, while I scraped and sold and held and cleaned and drove and administered and endured, and the spreadsheet made it look exactly the way it was, a ledger of exploitation, neat and irrefutable. I emailed Elena at 1:34 a.m. 7 years, $247,100. Column D is empty. She knew, Margaret knew. Elena replied at 2:17 a.m. This changes everything. We're no longer contesting a will. We're building a case for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Do not confront Daniel. Bring everything tomorrow. We need a forensic accountant. I closed the laptop, the screen died, and the kitchen settled into the half-dark of the broken streetlight, and the calculators fading green, and the smell of cold coffee and old paper, and the faint, persistent tang of perchloroethylene rising through the floorboards from the dry cleaners below, the smell of my life, chemical and sharp and entirely my own. $247,100. The number sat on my pillow that night. It pressed its weight against my forehead. It whispered what I already knew but had never been able to prove with the precision of a dollar sign in 7 years of canceled checks, that I had been the one who paid, always, for everything. And now that I had the receipts, literal, photocopied, archived by a father who loved me from a locked drawer, I was going to find out exactly what that overpayment entitled me to collect. I turned off the light, the calculator's glow died, the numbers stayed. I went to see the attorney alone, not because Elena advised it. She had, in fact, advised the opposite, But because there are certain truths that need to be excavated in private, the way an archaeologist excavates a bone, carefully with small tools in a silence that respects the weight of what's being uncovered. Richard Hale's office on Church Street looked different in the hard light of a weekday afternoon. The Victorian staircase still groaned its old wood protest, but the waiting room was busier. Two other clients sat in the leather chairs, one reading a newspaper with the fierce concentration of someone avoiding thought, the other staring at her phone with the blank expression of someone already consumed by it. The water dispenser in the corner burbled and settled. The receptionist's perfume, lilac, and something aggressively clean, like a hospital corridor, had settled into the upholstery like a stain. I gave my name. The receptionist checked her screen, paused in a way that felt rehearsed, and said Mr. Hale would be with me shortly. Shortly turned out to be 17 minutes. I had become a woman who counted things, plates, pages, minutes, dollars, because counting was what you did when the qualitative measures of your life had failed you. Numbers did not lie. Numbers did not rearrange themselves to favor the charming child over the useful one. Hale appeared in the doorway. He was wearing the same rectangular glasses, the same gray temples, but something in his posture had shifted since the will reading, a slight rounding of the shoulders, the forward lean of a man carrying something he had not yet set down. He shook my hand with both of his, the same warm, guilty grip he had used the last time, and led me down the hallway to his office. Not the conference room, his office. Smaller, more personal, a desk buried under files, a window overlooking the parking lot where I had stood with Daniel's hollow promises still ringing in my ears. On the wall, a diploma from Yale Law School and a photograph of a sailboat, the universal decoration of men who believe competence and leisure should be displayed with equal prominence. He offered coffee. I declined. The mug on his desk was already half empty, and the smell of burned filter coffee permeated the room, a bitter institutional scent that mixed with the wood polish and the particular mustiness of a building whose heating system had been recirculating the same air for 40 years. Miss Ashford, he said, settling into his chair. The leather wheezed. How can I help you? The will was updated in October, I said. I watched his face. 6 months before she died. He nodded, the kind of nod that confirms rather than responds, a small mechanical dip of the chin that buys time. Who requested the update? Pause. His fingers found a pen on the desk and began to turn it, end over end, in the slow rotation of a man whose habit of precision was being tested by his instinct for self-preservation. Your mother requested the appointment, he said. She came in. Well, she was brought in. She was in a wheelchair by that point. By whom? Another pause, longer. The pen stopped turning. Your brother accompanied her. The sentence landed like a small, precise explosion, contained, localized, but devastating in its blast radius. Daniel had brought Margaret to the attorney's office. Daniel had been present when the will was changed. Daniel had sat in the same Victorian waiting room, on the same leather chairs, while his mother, cognitively declining, physically deteriorating, dependent on the daughter she was about to erase, signed a document that gave him everything. Was he in the room during the signing? I asked. Hale's eyes shifted. Not away from me, he was too professional for that, but downward, toward the pen, as if it held a script he could follow. The fluorescent light above us buzzed. A car passed on Church Street, its tires hissing on the damp pavement. He stepped out during the actual execution, Hale said carefully. Standard procedure, the testator must sign without coercion. Stepped out, I repeated, after driving her there, after, presumably, discussing the contents with her beforehand. I can't speak to what was discussed outside this office. No, I said, but you can speak to her state of mind when she was in it. The silence that followed had texture, thick, fibrous, the silence of a man who knows he is being asked to testify against his own competence. Because if Margaret Ashford had lacked capacity when she signed that will, then Richard Hale had failed his most fundamental obligation as an attorney, to ensure that his client understood what she was signing. He removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose with thumb and forefinger, the universal gesture of professional exhaustion. "Miss Ashford," he said, "your mother was a formidable woman. Even in her last months, she had moments of extraordinary clarity. When she came to this office in October, she appeared to be lucid. She stated her wishes clearly. She signed the document in the presence of two witnesses, appeared to be." The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a match that had just been struck. "I documented everything per bar requirements," he said, and his voice had dropped half a register, the tonal shift of a man building a defensive wall, brick by careful brick. "Capacity assessment, witness statements, everything is in the file. I'd like a copy of that file." His jaw tightened. I could see the muscles flexing beneath the skin, the physical manifestation of a legal mind calculating risk. Emotion. If he gave me the file, he was cooperating with what might become a challenge to his own professional judgment. If he refused, he was obstructing a potential beneficiary's right to review estate documents. "I'll have my paralegal prepare copies," he said finally. "You should receive them within the week." I stood. The chair released me with a sigh of vinyl and compressed air. I smoothed my slacks. My mother's gesture, I realized, the automatic straightening of fabric that Margaret performed before every exit, as if appearance could armor you against what was waiting on the other side of the door. "Mr. Hale," I said from the doorway, "one more question." He looked up. The glasses were back on, the professional mask restored, but not perfectly. There was a hairline crack in his composure, the kind you can only see if you know what an intact structure looks like. Had my mother made a previous will before the October revision? The pen started turning again, faster now. "I'd have to check the records," he said, but his voice had gone thin, tissue paper thin, the way my mother's voice had gone in her final months, and in that thinness I heard everything I needed to hear. There had been a previous will. And whatever it said, Richard Hale did not want to be the one to tell me. I thanked him. I walked down the groaning staircase and out into the April afternoon, where the Bradford pear trees were dropping their petals on the sidewalk in slow white drifts. Beautiful, ornamental, structurally unsound. In the car, I called Elena. "Daniel drove her to the attorney's office," I said. "In October, when she was in a wheelchair. The attorney won't confirm a previous will, but he didn't deny it." His pen was shaking, Elena. A long pause. "Clara," Elena said, "if there's a previous will that predates the cognitive decline, and if Daniel orchestrated the revision, we're not just talking about inheritance anymore. We're talking about elder law, undue influence, possibly fraud. Possibly fraud." The Bradford pear petals collected on my windshield. I turned on the wipers and watched them scatter, white fragments whirling in the blade's arc before being swept aside. "Find that will," Elena said. "Whatever it takes, find the original." The paralegal's name was Ruth. She had gray hair pinned in a bun that looked like it had been built to withstand weather, and she wore a cardigan the color of weak tea, and she handed me the copies of my mother's file in a manila envelope that smelled of toner and apprehension. "Mr. Hale asked me to let you know," she said, adjusting her glasses, the small round kind that librarians and archivists wear, the kind that signal patience as a professional skill, "that the file is comprehensive. Both versions are included." Both versions. I stood in the lobby of Hale's office, the manila envelope warm against my ribs where I pressed it, and I let the phrase circulate through me the way a radiator lets steam circulate through a building, slowly, evenly, filling every cold corner. Both versions meant there had been an earlier will, Both versions meant that Richard Hale, in his quiet, pen-turning, guilt-shouldering way, had decided to give me the ammunition I needed without having to fire it himself. I did not open the envelope in the office. I did not open it in the car. I drove to Elena's, the manila envelope riding shotgun, propped against the seatbelt like a passenger too important to let slide. The day was overcast, a low pewter sky that pressed down on the Connecticut countryside like a lid, and the air coming through the cracked window smelled of damp asphalt and the distant metallic sweetness of rain gathering its nerve. Elena was waiting in her conference room, 2 coffees, a legal pad, her glasses already on, operational mode from the first second. She took the envelope from my hands the way a surgeon takes an instrument, with both hands, palms up, weight distributed. The first document was the October will, the one Hale had read in the conference room while I stared at the brass ship's clock and waited for a name that never came. Seeing it again in print was like rereading a medical diagnosis. The words were the same, but their meaning had compounded with time, each clause accruing interest like debt. The second document was dated March 15th, 3 years earlier. Elena unfolded it with the precision of someone handling parchment. The paper was heavier than the October version, a different stock, slightly cream-colored, the kind of paper that law firms used before everything went digital. The ink was different too, a deeper blue, the font serif and unhurried, the formatting of a document composed without urgency. The last will and testament of Margaret Eloise Ashford, Elena read aloud. Her voice had the measured pace of a courtroom reader, every syllable given its full architectural weight. Executed and notarized March 15th, she read. I listened, and what I heard was a different mother. Emotion. The original will divided the estate equally, 50% to Daniel Marcus Ashford, 50% to Clara Margaret Ashford. The house, the investments, the art collection, the silver, all of it split down the middle with the clean bilateral symmetry of a structure designed by someone who understood balance. My name was in every paragraph. I heard it the way a musician hears a note that has been missing from a chord, not with surprise, but with the physical relief of resolution, the tension in my chest releasing like a key turning in a lock. My name, Clara, over and over, in the specific, acknowledgement-heavy language of a woman who, at least 3 years ago, had considered her daughter an equal heir. The bequests are detailed, Elena said, tracing her finger down page 3. The house, jointly held, with a right of first refusal for either party. The investment portfolio, divided equally, with a provision for a financial advisor to manage the transition. The personal effects, she paused, her nail stopping on a line. The personal effects are allocated individually. The silver service goes to you, Clara. The art collection is split by appraised value. And there's a specific provision here. She looked up. Your mother included a provision for professional development, a fund $75,000 designated for the resumption of Clara's architectural career or equivalent professional retraining. It's itemized separately from the general estate. I could not speak. The room was very still. The espresso Elena had poured sat between us, its surface trembling with the building's ventilation. A micro vibration visible only if you were looking for it. The way you can see a bridge sway in the wind, only if you know that bridges are supposed to sway, that their strength comes not from rigidity, but from designed flexibility. $75,000 for my career. Margaret had set aside money specifically so that I could return to architecture. She had not merely divided the estate, she had tried to give back what she had taken. And then she had changed her mind. The October revision, I said. My voice was hoarse, as if the words had been stored in a room with no ventilation. When Daniel drove her to the office, revoked this entirely, Elena confirmed, and replaced it with the document Hale read. Everything to Daniel, nothing to you, no mention of the career fund, no 50-50 split, a complete inversion. I stood up and walked to the window. The city was gray, The glass was cold under my fingertips, and I pressed until I could feel my pulse against the pain, the slow, heavy rhythm of a heart that was processing not just betrayal, but the cruelty of having been loved and then unloved in the span of 7 months. Margaret had known what she owed me. She had written it down. She had assigned a dollar value to my sacrifice, $75,000, the price of a career, and she had included it in a legal document with witnesses and a notary stamp. And then in October, in a wheelchair, with Daniel at her side, she had erased all of it. The question was not whether Margaret had loved me. The original will proved she had. The question was what Daniel had done between March and October to make her stop. Elena, I said, still facing the window, watching the rain begin. Not a downpour, but a slow, specific precipitation, each drop distinct on the glass, each one running its own path, gathering others as it went. What kind of case do we have now? Elena's voice came from behind me, and it was very quiet and very certain. We have testament to 2 different states of mind. We have a pattern of financial exploitation. We have a trust your father created because he saw what was coming. We have an attorney who just handed us the evidence without being subpoenaed. A pause. The espresso cup clinked against its saucer with the clean ceramic precision of a gavel. Clara, we don't just have a case, we have a story. And stories, told correctly, with evidence and structure and the right emotional architecture, are what win trials. I turned from the window. Elena was leaning forward, both hands flat on the table, the same anchoring gesture we shared, and behind her glasses, her eyes held the specific, focused intensity of a woman who had just found the blueprint she'd been looking for. File the challenge, I said. Monday morning. File it Monday morning. And Elena, yes? Tell them who wrote the first will. A motion. Tell them what my mother thought I was worth before Daniel got to her. The rain picked up. Against the 10th floor glass, it sounded like the building itself was whispering, 1,000 small, insistent voices saying the same thing. It's time. Emotion. Filing a legal challenge against your dead mother's wishes is not something anyone prepares you for. There is no manual, no protocol, no social script that covers the moment when you walk into a courthouse with a folder full of evidence and tell a clerk, a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a rubber stamp worn smooth by decades of other people's crises, that you believe your mother was manipulated into disinheriting you. The courthouse smelled of floor wax and correction fluid, and the particular municipal staleness of buildings maintained by budget rather than pride, a scent that lived in the marble walls the way cold lives in stone, permanent and impersonal. The clerk's stamp hit the document with a dull, fleshy thud. Case filed. The sound was nothing like a gavel, softer, administrative, the kind of compression you feel in your chest when something irreversible happens at a volume too low to be dramatic. She handed me a carbon copy, the paper's edge damp from the ink pad, the purple imprint still shining wet under the fluorescent tubes, those flat, humming lights that turned everything they touched the color of headache. Elena stood beside me in a charcoal suit that smelled of dry-cleaned wool and the cedar blocks she kept in her closet, sense of storage and preparation, of a woman who maintained her armor the way a soldier maintains a rifle. She took the carbon copy from my hands, examined it, and placed it in her briefcase with the precision of a carpenter leveling a shelf. "It's done," she said. "Done." But what was done was only the first cut. The initial incision in what Elena had warned me would be a long, methodical surgery. Daniel would be served within 72 hours. His reaction, she predicted, would follow a pattern: shock, charm, threats, lawyers. The progression was as predictable as the 5 stages of grief, except that in Daniel's version, bargaining would come armed with attorneys, and acceptance would never come at all. We walked out into a May morning that was trying too hard to be beautiful. The dogwoods had bloomed in frothing white clusters along the courthouse fence, and the forsythia blazed yellow against the brick like small, contained fires. The air had that particular fragile sweetness of late spring, chlorophyll and pollen, and the distant, barely perceptible decay of last year's leaves finally surrendering beneath the mulch. I could taste it on the back of my tongue, vegetal and alive, and for a moment the taste was so vivid it felt like a message I did not yet know how to read. In the car, the leather seats were warm from the morning sun, and the steering wheel smelled of the hand cream I applied every night, almond oil and shea butter, the only luxury I had not surrendered. Elena laid out the timeline. Daniel will retain Crawford and Associates. Emosen Adiolan Adavlanida. Bill Crawford is 70, plays golf with judges, and has never lost a probate challenge. He will move to dismiss on testamentary freedom the argument that Margaret had the right to leave her assets however she chose. She did, I said, if she was of sound mind. That's where our case lives. In the 7 months between the original will and the revision, her medical records will show cognitive decline, her hospice intake will show it, and the attorney's own notes will show he had concerns about capacity that he documented but did not act on. He was covering himself. He was building a lifeboat, and we are going to ride it. The phone call came on Wednesday, 3 days after Daniel was served. I was at my kitchen table, the same table that had held Victor's filing cabinet, the bank statements, the will, and now a growing terrain of legal motions and highlighted depositions that smelled of fresh printer toner and the faintly acrid scent of yellow highlighter ink, when my phone buzzed once against the wood. Daniel, I let it ring 4 times. Elena had coached me. Do not sound angry, do not explain, let him fill the silence. Clara, his voice was different. The boyish warmth had been replaced by something tighter, like a rope pulled taut, and beneath it I could hear the ambient noise of a room with hard surfaces, tile, glass, empty space. The library turned theater, I guessed, the speakers not yet installed, the room still hollow with its own renovation. What is this? What are you doing? I'm contesting the will, Daniel. You're contesting Mom's will? Our mother's will? I'm contesting a document signed by a woman in cognitive decline who was driven to the attorney's office by the sole beneficiary of that document. Silence. The kind with mass pressing against the phone, compressing the air between us across the miles. I could hear him breathing. Short, measured inhales through the nose, the controlled respiration of a man trying not to let his body betray what his voice was already failing to conceal. You don't want to do this, Clara. This will tear the family apart. You dragged it through a bank, 7 years of withdrawals, Daniel, $247,000. The second silence was structural. I had knocked out a load-bearing wall, and the facade was, for one long moment, entirely unsupported. Through the phone, I heard something that might have been his hand hitting a surface. A dull, flat impact. The sound of frustration finding the nearest hard object. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. But his voice had climbed half a register, the consonants sharp and wet, the acoustic signature of a lie being constructed with the mortar still damp. You will, I said, when you see what Dad left in the filing cabinet. I hung up. My hands shook, not from fear, from the specific electric discharge of a woman who has spent 20 years swallowing her voice and has just spoken at full volume into the ear of the person who taught her to whisper. The phone was warm in my palm, slick with perspiration, and I set it face down on the table and pressed both hands flat. My anchoring gesture, the one Elena shared, the one that meant I am here, I am present, I am not going anywhere. The refrigerator hummed. The perchloroethylene rose through the floorboards in its sharp chemical intimacy. The legal documents caught the overhead light. Elena called 10 minutes later. He didn't deny the withdrawals, I said. He said he didn't know what I was talking about, but he didn't deny them. A pause. Then Elena's voice, precise as a scalpel. Good. The first rule of structural engineering, you'd know this better than anyone, is that a building that has to defend itself has already admitted it's under stress. Outside my window, the broken streetlight on Maple Street flickered once and went dark again. But for that one moment, it had cast a small, brave circle of light on the wet sidewalk, a circle that looked, from my angle, almost exactly like a spotlight. Emotion. The letters started arriving on the third day after Daniel was served. Not legal letters, family letters, the handwritten kind, on monogrammed stationery that crackled when you unfolded it, the sound of expensive paper performing its own credentials. Aunt Helen's was the first. She wrote on cream-colored linen paper, embossed with her initials, HEA, Helen Elizabeth Ashford, in script so practiced it looked engraved. I held the paper up to the kitchen light and watched the watermark shimmer. A tiny crown, the papermaker's signature, visible only when light passed through the fibers like sun through fog. The paper smelled of the lavender sachet she kept in her writing desk, a scent I recognized from childhood visits, cultivated sweetness wrapped around words that were anything but sweet. Dear Clara, she wrote, the ink a dark Mont Blanc blue that smudged slightly at the downstrokes where her pen had pressed. Your decision to contest your mother's wishes has caused great distress to the family. Margaret was a woman of strong conviction, and to question her final testament is to question the very foundation of who she was. I traced the words with my fingertip, feeling the slight furrow the pen nib had left in the paper, the physical impression of conviction, the very foundation of who she was, as if Margaret's decision to erase me had been philosophical rather than the last act of a cognitively declining woman, guided by a son draining her accounts. Cousin Martin's letter arrived the following morning in a business envelope with his corporate logo, some consulting firm in Stamford that used the word synergies without irony. His letter was written in ballpoint on printer paper, the handwriting slanting forward with the aggressive lean of a man in a hurry. It smelled of nothing, the olfactory blankness of a man who communicated through surfaces. Clara heard about the legal situation. Not sure this is the way to go. Happy to chat if you want a guy's perspective. A guy's perspective. I folded Martin's letter into Helen's, a growing stack on my kitchen counter, next to the coffee pot with its ring of dried drip stains and the ceramic bowl where I kept spare change and rubber bands, the small domestic artifacts of a life everyone seemed to think I should be content with. By Friday, there were 7 letters. Emotion. Uncle Stephen from Phoenix sent a Hallmark card with a watercolor sunset on the front, peaches and golds bleeding into each other the way only cheap printing allows, beautiful and imprecise. Inside, beneath the verse about walking through shadows, he had written in pencil, as if even his sentiments might need erasing, family is everything. Don't let money make you forget that. Money. As if the woman who sold her condominium to pay medical bills, cashed out her retirement for hospice, spent 17 years working for free as a full-time caretaker, as if that woman had become mercenary. The accusation was so perfectly backwards it took my breath the way cold wind takes it, sharply, completely, leaving you gasping in a direction you hadn't expected. The phone calls were worse. Aunt Helen's voicemail arrived at 6:47 on a Thursday, early enough to be punitive, late enough to be deniable. I listened to it standing at the kitchen counter, the phone's speaker vibrating against the formica surface with a faint buzz that made Helen's voice sound like it was coming from inside the counter itself, as if even the furniture were delivering her verdict. Clara, your mother would be ashamed. She gave her life to this family, and now you're dragging her name through a court. I played it twice. On the second listening, the performance became clinical. I could hear the rehearsed hitch in her breath, the practiced indignation, the way she paused after ashamed for exactly 1 beat, the rhythmic precision of a woman who had run through her lines until they sounded authentic. Daniel had gotten to them. Charm was his infrastructure. He would have called Helen first, the family's amplifier, the woman who turned private opinion into public consensus. Then Martin, because Martin deferred to hierarchy. Then Stephen, too far away to investigate, too trusting to question. The ecosystem had closed ranks, and I was outside, not because I had left, but because they had decided, with the collective efficiency of a body rejecting a foreign organ, that the woman who had held them together was now the thing threatening to tear them apart. I sat with the letters spread across my table, their papers overlapping, cream linen, white printer stock, glossy Hallmark cardboard, each texture distinct under my fingertips, each one carrying a different weight but the same message. You are wrong, you are greedy, you are breaking something sacred. None of them asked what had been broken before I got there. I brewed a pot of coffee, the cheap kitchen canister kind, its grounds dark and wet and fragrant with the particular bitterness of low-altitude beans, the smell of austerity made domestic, and called Elena. Emotion. They're all lining up with Daniel, I said. Every one of them. Expected. Elena's voice was the temperature of steel. Save everything. Every letter is a character witness we didn't subpoena. They're documenting, in their own handwriting, the family dynamic that produced this situation. A daughter who served 20 years, and a family that calls her greedy when she asks for recognition. They think I'm doing this for money. Clara, 1 degree warmer, the calibration of 30 years of knowing exactly when I needed facts and when I needed acknowledgement. You sold your home. You gave up your career. You spent 17 years doing work none of them would do, and the woman you did it for wrote you out of existence. The numbers disagree. The original disagrees. And your father's filing cabinet disagrees. I looked at the letters, the monogrammed cream, the corporate ballpoint, the Hallmark sunset in its bleeding peach printing. Not one of these people had called when I was changing bedpans at 2 a.m. Not one had offered a shift, a pharmacy run, a single night sitting with my mother when the morphine wore off and the house filled with her frightened voice calling for Victor, 3 years dead, while I held her hand and whispered, I'm here. It's Clara. I'm here. I gathered the letters, squared the edges, feeling the different papers align under my palms, the linen sliding against the printer stock, the Hallmark's gloss catching against the rough edge of Martin's envelope. I placed them in a folder. Family correspondence. Every letter was a brick. They thought they were building a wall against me. They were building my case. Emotion. The mediator's office was designed to suggest neutrality. Beige walls, beige carpet, beige chairs arranged in a circle that was supposed to evoke equality, but that actually evoked a dental waiting room for people whose teeth had been pulled by family. The mediator herself was a woman named Dr. Sandra Chen, retired family court judge, silver bob, reading glasses on a chain of tiny amethyst beads that clicked against each other when she moved her head, producing a sound like a very small, very patient rosary. She smelled of green tea and the particular powdery fragrance of women who have spent decades in rooms where people cannot stop hurting each other. Daniel arrived first. This surprised me. But the man who walked in at 9:52 bore only surface resemblance to the brother at his party. This Daniel wore a dark suit, no linen, no rolled sleeves. His Cartier was gone, replaced by a simple leather strap watch whispering modesty. He had been styled by a lawyer, by the machine that produced whatever version of Daniel each situation required. His attorney, Bill Crawford, was exactly as Elena described, 70, silver-haired, the ruddy complexion of a man whose Saturdays were golf and whose weekdays were courtrooms where outcomes had been negotiated on the 9th hole. His briefcase was brown leather, old, scarred, authority derived from age, not polish. It smelled of tobacco and saddle soap. Elena and I sat opposite. She wore black litigation uniform, legal pad open, pen uncapped, posture the geometry of a woman who had spent 30 years leaning into opposition. Dr. Chen spoke, her California neutral voice, warm without warmth, professional without cold, proposed mutually agreeable resolution. The amethyst beads clicked. Daniel spoke first. Of course, I want to start by saying I love my sister. He looked at me. His eyes were the right temperature, warm, pained, sincere, masterful. A man who could summon that quality of hurt on demand was not a man who felt hurt. He was a man who had studied it. This has been incredibly difficult. I believe we can work this out as family. I opened my folder, tabbed, color-coded, each document in chronological position like floors in a building. In March, 3 years ago, my mother executed a will dividing her estate equally, including $75,000 designated for the resumption of my architectural career, which I abandoned to care for our parents. I placed the original will on the table, cream paper glowing under flat light. 7 months later, Daniel drove our mother, in a wheelchair, with documented cognitive decline, to the same attorney where she signed a revised will leaving everything to Daniel. The October will, beside the first. 2 documents, 7 months, 2 completely different stories. During the 7 prior years, Daniel withdrew $247,000 from our mother's savings. During this same period, I sold my condominium, liquidated my retirement, and covered medical expenses from accounts Daniel was emptying. Spreadsheet, bank statements, calculators cold arithmetic, Daniel's composure held. But something behind his eyes shifted, a tectonic adjustment at the fault line. Crawford's hand moved to Daniel's arm, the physical equivalent of a lawyer whispering, "Don't react." "These are serious allegations," Crawford said, voiced the velvet rasp of old authority. "I caution against claims that cannot be substantiated." Elena leaned forward. Her glasses caught the light and flashed once. "Every claim is substantiated. Bank records from Victor Ashford's archive, medical bills from Clara's records, the original will from Mr. Hale's files provided voluntarily. The room contracted, beige walls pressing inward. The air, already stale with recycled neutrality, grew warmer, as if the building's HVAC had withdrawn its services from this particular disagreement. Daniel broke, not dramatically. He broke the way ice breaks over a river in early spring, a slow spreading fracture that started at his jaw, moved to his shoulders, and ended in his hands gripping the beige armrests with enough force to whiten his knuckles. "You want to know what I think?" He directed it at me, and his voice had shed every layer, every coat of warmth and concern, leaving something pale and hard and furious. "I think you're jealous. I think you've always been jealous. Mom saw something in me that she didn't see in you, and you can't accept that." "Daniel," Crawford's hand firmer now. "No. Emotion." "She needs to hear this." He pulled free. "Nobody told you to quit your job. You did that because you wanted to be needed, and now you're angry because being needed wasn't enough." The words hit with surgical precision, at an angle designed to separate things that had been connected. For one airless moment, I felt them cut, because there was a grain of truth, a splinter of something real. I had wanted to be needed, but wanting to be needed was not the same as wanting to be invisible. And Daniel had spent 20 years making sure those 2 things looked identical. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. "Dr. Chen," I said, "I think we've learned what we came here to learn." Elena closed her legal pad. The click of her pen's cap was the only sound, sharp, final. We left without resolution. In the elevator, Elena stood beside me in silence. The good silence, the kind that wraps around you without the pretense of comfort. The elevator smelled of cleaning solution and the warm electrical scent of cables working. A small enclosed container carrying us from one floor of this process to the next. When the doors opened onto the street, the June sun hit us like a verdict. "Trial," Elena said. But I was thinking of something Daniel had said, the thing he hadn't meant to reveal, the structural error hidden inside his cruelty like a load-bearing flaw in an otherwise convincing facade. Mom saw something in me that she didn't see in you. Saw, past tense. Not the assertion of a man who believed in his own merit, but the confession of a man who knew his advantage had been manufactured, who knew somewhere beneath the charm in the watch and the carefully curated outrage that what Margaret had seen in him was not greatness, it was a mirror. Daniel was Margaret's architecture, her design, her projection, the sun she had built to carry forward the version of herself she most wanted to survive. And now that architecture was going to be examined in a courtroom, under oath, with a structural engineer sitting on the other side of the aisle, me. Trial, I said, and the word tasted like the first line on a blueprint. Clean, precise, and full of everything that was about to be built. Widusrow. The night before the trial, I sat on the bathroom floor of my apartment above the dry cleaners, with my back against the cold porcelain of the bathtub, and my father's second letter in my hands, and I thought about quitting for the first and only time. The letter had been tucked inside the lining of the filing cabinet's second drawer, not filed, not organized, but hidden, as if Victor had written it in a moment so private that even his own system felt too exposed. I had found it 3 days ago while reorganizing evidence binders, when my finger caught on a loose seam in the drawer's fabric lining and the paper slid out like a breath held too long. It was shorter than the first, handwritten on a page torn from a yellow legal pad, not architect's bond, not engineer's graph, but the common cheap paper of a man who had run out of time for ceremony. The ink was black, not blue, Shakir. The letters trembled in a way Victor's hand had never trembled before. Clara, it began. No, dear, just my name, raw, like a hand reaching for a railing in the dark. I am writing this because I am afraid I am dying and because there are things I must tell you that I could not say while your mother was alive. Not because I was a coward, though I was, but because saying them would have destroyed the only structure your mother understood, and I was not brave enough to watch her fall. I pressed my spine against the tub. The porcelain was cold through my thin cotton pajamas, and the cold felt necessary, a corrective to the heat building behind my eyes. The bathroom was dark except for the hallway light, which fell across the tile in a long amber parallelogram, like a doorway into a warmer room. Your mother loved you. I need you to know that, even though the evidence of her life suggests otherwise. Margaret loved you the way a building loves its foundation, unconsciously, structurally, without the vocabulary to express it. She leaned on you because you were the only thing strong enough, and she resented you for the same reason, because your strength was a constant reminder of her own fragility. I read the paragraph 3 times. Each reading peeled back a layer. The first gave me words, the second gave me weight, the third gave me smell, pipe tobacco and linseed oil, and the particular quiet of a man writing at a workbench at midnight. Daniel was never strong. Daniel was bright and charming and beautiful, and your mother saw in him the version of herself she wished she had been. A Mosin.
But charm is not load-bearing, Clara. It cannot hold weight. It can only redirect attention while the weight is carried somewhere else. By you. Always by you. The pipes in the wall behind me gurgled. Old plumbing, the water heater 3 floors down, cycling with a rhythm like slow mechanical breathing. I listened. I let it be the sound of something larger than myself still functioning, still carrying, still working in the dark. When the time comes, and the time will come, do not let them tell you that you are selfish for wanting what you earned. Do not let them call you greedy. You are not taking anything. You are excavating what was buried. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a thief and an archaeologist. Intent, a thief and an archaeologist. My father, the quiet man, the birdhouse builder, the man who said yes, Margaret, and smiled at the dinner table while his wife arranged reality like furniture. had found in his last letter the metaphor I needed more than anything. I was not stealing from my family. I was uncovering what my family had buried. The perchloroethylene drifted through the floorboards, that sharp chemical scent of my solitude. Below, the streetlight on Maple Street was broken, and the darkness outside was total, the kind that exists only where no one with authority to complain lives. I thought about quitting. I let the thought sit with me the way you let a fever sit. Not fighting, not engaging, just observing its temperature and waiting for it to break. The thought said, you are alone. The thought said, your family hates you. The thought said, even if you win, you will lose them, and losing a family you never had is still a loss, because hope is the most expensive thing you can carry. The thought broke. Victor's letter had done what his first letter could not. It gave me permission.
Not to fight. I had that. Permission to need to fight. Permission to admit that this was not about money or property. It was about the most basic question a person can ask. Did I matter? I folded the letter along its worn crease and held it against my chest like a compass. Not because it knows where you are, but because it knows which direction is forward. I stood from the bathroom floor, knees popping, cold tiles protest. I walked to the kitchen, brewed coffee, sat at my table with the evidence binders, and then I did something I had not done in 17 years. I opened the cardboard tube at the back of my closet. Inside, still rolled tight, still smooth as untouched skin, the blueprint, my blueprint. The last design I had drawn at Whitfield and Chambers, a community library in Bridgeport. Never built, the one my mentor had called the best thing to come out of this firm in a decade. I unrolled it across the kitchen table on top of the legal files and the bank statements and the original will. The blue lines were still sharp. The proportions were still true. The negative space between the structural elements was still exactly right because I had drawn it, and what I drew with precision. I pressed my palm flat against the paper. The drafting vellum was cool and smooth and impossibly light for something that had been carrying the weight of my identity for 17 years in a cardboard tube behind winter coats I never wore. Tomorrow, I would walk into a courtroom and I would present the architecture of an injustice, every beam, every joint, every hidden flaw in the structure my mother and brother had built around me. But tonight, for 10 quiet minutes in a kitchen above a dry cleaner's, I looked at the building I had designed when I was still someone, and I remembered that the woman who drew it was the same woman who would stand up in court. The coffee went cold, the fluorescent light buzzed, the blueprint glowed, and the first light of morning found me still there, awake, ready, and no longer invisible. The courtroom smelled of furniture polish and the residual anxiety of every family that had ever sat in these pews and waited for a stranger in a black robe to tell them what they were worth. The wood of the gallery benches was dark walnut, worn to a satin gloss by decades of restless hands, and it had absorbed so many nervous conversations that the grain itself seemed to hum with whispered prayers and suppressed arguments. Judge Patricia Okafor presided from a bench elevated just enough to suggest authority. She was a small woman with close-cropped gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and her face held the particular stillness of someone who has heard every version of human selfishness. Her courtroom was 4B of the Fairfield County Probate Court, and its east-facing windows let the morning light fall across the gallery in long, pale stripes that looked like lines on a page waiting to be written. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Elena. My hands were flat on the oak surface, cheaper than Hale's mahogany, worn smooth by 1,000 litigants' elbows, smelling of lemon oil and something older, the accumulated residue of decisions that changed lives. My navy blouse was ironed with the precision my mother had demanded. My father's gold watch was on my wrist, tick, 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 measuring the distance between who I had been and who I was about to become. Daniel sat across the aisle, dark suit, no linen, the modesty costume, his Cartier replaced by a simple leather strap. Crawford beside him, 70, ruddy, his scarred briefcase catching the eastern light like a relic. They looked like a portrait of tradition and order. Elena opened her case. Her voice filled the courtroom the way water fills a vessel, finding every corner, leaving nothing untouched. She walked the judge through the parallel wills, the March and October versions, the way an architect walks a client through drawings. She presented the financial evidence on a projector. Each withdrawal glowed blue on the screen. Each medical bill I had paid burned red. The colors accumulated like a bruise and time lapse, blue taking from the left, red pouring from the right. My life measured in the gap between what Daniel extracted and what I replaced. $247,100 in blue, $189,400 in red. Column D, empty. Aunt Helen sat in the third row, her peacock scarf folded in her lap, her perfume, the same institutional lavender, reaching me even across the gallery, faint and insistent, the olfactory signature of a woman who believed composure had a scent. Then Elena called me to the stand. Emotion. I stood, my legs held. They had been holding things for 20 years. The walk to the witness stand was 11 steps. I had counted them during recess, pacing the distance the way I used to pace construction sites, embedding the dimensions in my body so I wouldn't stumble. The courtroom air was cool, processed through ventilation that hummed just below hearing, the building itself breathing. The witness chair was wooden, hard, its back angled slightly forward to prevent comfort. I sat. The varnish was smooth and cold under my palms, and I could feel a nick in the armrest's edge, a small half-moon impression left by someone's fingernail, someone who had gripped this chair the way I was gripping it now, pressing their own anxiety into the wood like a signature. Miss Ashford, Elena said, can you describe the circumstances under which you left your career? I described them, the phone call, the drafting table with the brass lamp, the harbor view. I spoke the way I had been taught, precisely, because imprecision costs lives. The resignation letter at 3 a.m, the ink bleeding on regretfully, the hospital bed assembled by the window for Victor's garden view, the smell of institutional sheets and the sound of a man breathing through a machine, and the weight of his hand in mine, lighter every week, as if his body were slowly subtracting itself from the world. My voice did not crack. My voice was an instrument I had spent 48 years tuning, and today I played it with control, with beauty, with the understanding that the audience would feel exactly what I allowed them to feel. Crawford's cross came after lunch. He was avuncular, measured, attacks wrapped in the syntax of concern. You chose to leave your career, isn't that right? I chose between my career and my father's life. The choice was presented as a choice. It was not. Your brother contributed in other ways. Phone calls, visits, 2 phone calls from airports, 3 weekend visits the final year. Emotion.
No financial contribution. None. You have detailed records of your brother's involvement. I do. I leaned forward. The wooden chair creaked. A sound like a question being asked by the furniture itself. I have detailed records because for 17 years I was the only one keeping track. Not because I anticipated this moment, because my father taught me that precision is a form of love. The courtroom held its breath. I could feel the collective inhalation, the particular suspended quality of air in a room where something true has just been said with enough force to make the clock on the wall sound louder. Even the HVAC seemed to pause, that persistent mechanical hum dropping away for one long airless moment, as if the building itself were listening. Crawford retreated to his table. His hand trembled, just enough for me to see, the way Hale's pen had trembled months ago. The tremor of a man whose certainty had developed a hairline crack. Judge Okafor made a note. Her pen moved with unhurried precision across the paper. I stepped down from the stand, 11 steps back. The courtroom floor was cool through my flat shoes. The tile grouted in a geometric pattern that reminded me of a design I had once drawn. A library floor, in another life, in a city I no longer lived in. Elena caught my eye. She did not smile. She did not nod. She looked at me the way a builder looks at a structure that has just passed its load test, with satisfaction, and with the certain knowledge that what came next would test it further. Because tomorrow was Daniel's turn on the stand. Tomorrow, Alina would ask him about October, about the wheelchair, the drive, the document. She would ask him about the withdrawals, the missing contributions, the original will he had never mentioned to anyone, and Daniel, for the first time in his life, would have to answer questions in a room where charm was not currency, where the only currency was truth, and truth, unlike charm, was load-bearing, emotion.
Daniel took the oath with his right hand raised and his left resting flat on the Bible's leather cover. And he looked so convincing, so steady, so sincere, that for one vertigo-inducing moment, I almost believed him myself. That was the thing about my brother. He did not lie the way most people lie, with averted eyes and fidgeting hands. Daniel lied the way a building presents its facade, with perfect symmetry, flawless proportions, and not a single visible clue that behind the front wall there was nothing but scaffolding and air. Crawford led him through the opening questions with the gentle authority of a man guiding a prize horse through a dressage routine. Daniel's voice was measured, warm, slightly rough at the edges, the calibrated vulnerability of a man who wanted you to know that this was hard for him. He spoke about Margaret with the reverence of a eulogy, his sentences crafted like obituary paragraphs, generous, selective, structurally misleading. "My mother was the strongest person I ever knew," he said, and the courtroom absorbed the statement the way dry wood absorbs stain, quickly, completely, the color changing before you could assess the shade. She knew her own mind. She made her decisions with full awareness of their consequences. "Then the October revision?" Crawford prompted. "She asked me to drive her. She had mobility issues, but her mind was sharp. She told me exactly what she wanted. I was just the driver. Just the driver." The phrase sat in the air with the manufactured innocence of a getaway car parked in a loading zone. I watched Elena circle it on her legal pad, a small, decisive oval, the way a surgeon marks the site of an incision. Elena's cross-examination began at 2:15 p.m. The afternoon light had shifted from east to west, and the courtroom had taken on a different quality. Warmer, more amber, the shadows longer, as if the building itself were settling in for the revelation it knew was coming. "Mr. Ashford," Elena said, standing beside our table, her voice the precise temperature of surgical steel warmed to body temperature. "You testified that your mother's mind was sharp in October. Is that correct?" "It is. Are you aware that her hospice intake assessment, conducted 6 weeks after the will revision, noted, and I'm quoting, moderate cognitive impairment with episodic disorientation and impaired recall of recent events?" Daniel's jaw tightened. The first structural crack, hairline, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. I was looking for it. Hospice assessments those are medical judgments made by trained professionals, Elena finished. Emotion.
Hence, yes. Let me direct your attention to the bank records, Exhibit C. The projector flickered to life. 7 years of withdrawals in blue, glowing on the white screen like the readout of a seismograph recording an earthquake in slow motion. Can you explain these withdrawals from your mother's accounts? Daniel looked at Crawford. The look lasted exactly 1 second, the universal duration of a man checking with his handler before responding, and Crawford gave a microscopic nod. "Those were gifts," Daniel said. "My mother made gifts to me. It was her money. She chose to share it." "Gifts," Elena repeated. She let the word hang in the air like a smoke signal. $41,500 in a single month is a gift? "My mother was generous. Your mother was generous to you," Elena said. "I'd like to show you Exhibit F, Clara Ashford's financial records for the same period." The screen split. Blue on the left, Daniel's withdrawals. Red on the right, my expenditures. The two columns grew in parallel like separate buildings rising on the same street, one being constructed, the other being demolished. Mr. Ashford, were you aware that during the years you were receiving these gifts, your sister was selling her condominium, liquidating her retirement savings, and paying your parents' medical bills from her personal income? I knew she was helping out. Clara always. Was she helping out, Mr. Ashford, or was she replacing the funds you were taking? I object to the characterization, Crawford said, rising. His voice was steady, but his hand gripped the table's edge, and his knuckles had gone the color of old piano keys, ivory stressed, weight-bearing. Sustained as to characterization, Judge Okafor said. Rephrase. Alina did not miss a beat. Were you aware that the total amount of your withdrawals, $247,100, exceeded the total amount of medical expenses your sister paid by $57,700? Silence. The courtroom was so quiet that I could hear the fluorescent tubes buzzing above us, that flat institutional frequency that turned silence into a physical substance, vibrating and dense. Daniel swallowed. Emotion.
I watched his throat work, the same involuntary mechanism I had watched in Elena when she read Victor's letter, except that in Daniel's case, what was being swallowed was not empathy. It was the realization that the numbers had geometry, and geometry did not lie. You didn't track your sister's expenditures, but you tracked your mother's accounts with enough precision to make 43 separate withdrawals over 7 years, each one within the gift tax exemption threshold. That requires tracking, Mr. Ashford. That requires arithmetic. Daniel looked at me for the first time in the trial, for the first time perhaps since childhood. He looked at me without a mask, and what I saw behind his eyes was not remorse, it was fear. The specific structural fear of a man who has just realized that the building he has been living in was never sound, that the foundation was fraudulent, that the load-bearing walls were hollow, and that the woman he had dismissed as infrastructure was the engineer who knew exactly where to place the charges. Judge Okafor called a recess. As Daniel stepped down from the stand, his Italian loafers made no sound on the courtroom tile, as if even his shoes had lost their confidence. In the hallway, Elena turned to me. The fluorescent light painted her face in flat, unforgiving planes. "He's going to offer a settlement tonight," she said. "They always do when the cross goes this badly. And if he does..." Elena's gold earrings caught the light, geometric, sharp, the jewelry of a woman who built power from angles. "Then we decide what you're worth, Clara, not Margaret. Not Daniel, not the family that wrote letters on monogrammed paper. You, for the first time in your life, you get to set the price." I leaned against the hallway wall. The paint was cool through my blouse, institutional beige, the same shade as the mediation room, the same shade as every room designed to contain the things people do to each other. But I was no longer contained. Emotional loss. "I don't want a settlement," I said. "I want a verdict." Judge Okafor took 11 days to render her decision, 11 days during which I did not sleep through a single night, did not eat a meal I could later remember the taste of, did not once look in a mirror without seeing the ghost of my mother's face superimposed on mine like a double exposure, the same cheekbones, the same pale blue eyes, the same mouth that could hold silence like a vessel holds water. The call came on a Tuesday. Alina's voice was clipped, efficient, the vocal equivalent of a surgeon tying her mask. Rulings in, court at 2. I dressed, the navy blouse, its cotton stiff from the dollar store starch I used because the good kind cost 4 times as much. The gold watch, cool against my pulse, its second hand sweeping with the quiet authority of a mechanism that did not care whether the news was good or bad. Clean flats with rubber soles, the kind you wear when your legs might tremble and the floor might be marble, and the combination of the two might betray you. The drive was 22 minutes. The July heat had turned the asphalt nearly liquid. I could see it shimmer in the rear view, the road dissolving into a watery blur. The air through the cracked window tasted of hot tar and cut grass and the cloying, rotting sweet perfume of Bradford pear blossoms that lined every road in this county, their white petals browning at the edges like pages in a book left open to the sun. Elena stood at the plaintiff's table. Her legal pad was closed, the first time since I had known her. She wore dark blue, not black, not litigation armor, something that allowed for hope. Her perfume was different today, too, not the usual citrus and cedar of combat, but something softer, warmer, the olfactory equivalent of an unclenched fist. Daniel entered 4 minutes late, linen blazer, the pale blue from the funeral. He had abandoned the modesty costume and returned to himself, as if he decided to meet whatever came looking like the man he was. Crawford walked beside him with the heavy tread of a fighter who has stopped expecting the knockout, his wingtips scuffing against the marble with a flat, defeated sound. Judge Okafor entered. The courtroom rose and sat in a synchronized exhalation that carried the scent of cooling coffee and the metallic tang of bodies in stress, that particular chemical sharpness that anxiety releases through skin, the pheromone of people awaiting a decision that would restructure their relationships forever. Okafor opened a folder. Emotion. The paper rustled, the same dry leaf whisper I had heard in Hale's conference room a lifetime ago, when a different document was opened and my name was absent. In the matter of Ashford Vars, the estate of Margaret Eloise Ashford. Her voice was even, metronomic, each syllable a load-bearing element. She acknowledged the complexity. She noted the competing wills. She referenced the financial evidence. The court finds, by a preponderance of the evidence, that the October revision to the decedent's will was executed under conditions of undue influence. Undue influence, the phrase detonated silently. I felt it in my chest, not explosion but decompression, the sudden release of a sealed chamber's pressure. The air shifted. Aunt Helen's hand flew to her mouth, her gray cardigan sleeve sliding back to reveal a thin wrist mapped with veins, the fragile infrastructure of a woman confronting the collapse of her chosen narrative. Crawford's pen stopped moving, suspended above the legal pad like a construction crane that had run out of purpose. The court reinstates the March will as the operative testamentary document. Reinstated 50-50, the career fund, my name, Clara, in every paragraph. Additionally, the court confirms Clara Margaret Ashford's status as sole beneficiary of the irrevocable trust established by Victor H. Ashford. Alina's hand found mine under the table. Dry, strong, absolutely steady. The grip of a woman who understood that victory, like any load-bearing structure, needed a moment to settle before you tested its weight. Daniel's eyes closed, a slow lowering, the facial architecture of a man watching from inside as everything he'd built collapsed. His hands rested on the table, palms down, and I noticed, with the detached architectural precision that had become my default mode of perception, that his fingers were trembling. Small, involuntary oscillations like the micro-vibrations you feel in a building during a distant impact. The judge continued, forensic accounting, restitution calculations, emotion, the slow dismantling of Daniel's financial architecture, the legal machinery grinding with patient institutional rhythm, but the foundation of the verdict was this: Clara Ashford existed. Clara Ashford mattered. Clara Ashford's name belonged in her mother's will. I did not cry in the courtroom. I cried in the car, in the parking lot where Daniel's promises had once hung in the air like cologne. I sat behind the wheel of my 10-year-old Camry, cracked dashboard, faded air freshener, pharmacy bags on the passenger seat, and I cried. Not controlled weeping. This was tectonic, the raw, ugly release of a body that had held itself together with precision for 20 years and had finally been given permission to fall apart. The tears tasted of salt and relief, and the mineral bitterness of something poisonous being expelled. The toxin of invisibility, leaching through my eyes and running down my chin and dripping onto the steering wheel where my hands had gripped at 10 and 2 through 20 years of driving to pharmacies and hospitals and funerals and a life lived in service to people who could not see her. When the crying ran its course, leaving me hollow and clean like a room after the furniture has been moved, I started the engine. I did not drive to my apartment. I drove to Winding Ridge Road, my house, half mine by Victor's trust, the other half mine by a judge's verdict. I parked in the driveway. The contractor's van was gone. The roses, Victor's roses, had overgrown their beds, canes tangled and thorny and desperately, extravagantly alive, their blooms deep red against the white clapboard of the house. I walked to the front door. The brass keyring was in my hand, the same one I'd carried for 20 years, the one Margaret never asked for back because she assumed I would always be the one to lock up. I opened the door. The foyer smelled of dust and absence and the faintest trace of Chanel number 5. Margaret's last signature, persistent as a stain, lingering in the walls the way a voice lingers in a room after the speaker has gone. I stepped inside a house that for the first time in my life was mine. Emotion. Daniel called 2 weeks after the verdict. I was pruning my father's roses when my phone buzzed in my back pocket, and I looked at his name through the green canvas of my gardening gloves and thought, so this is what he sounds like now. Not charm, not warmth, not the boyish cadence of a man who has spent his life converting sincerity into currency. Daniel's voice on the phone was thin, compressed, stripped to its studs, the voice of a man standing in the wreckage of a building he had believed was permanent and discovering for the first time what his own echo sounded like without the walls to bounce it back. "I'm not calling to argue," he said. I could hear traffic behind him, horns, the distant percussive rhythm of a city that did not care about the Ashford family's rearranged geography. I wanted to talk to you. I set the pruning shears on the garden wall. The metal was warm from the August sun, and the rose scent hung around me like a veil, sweet, layered, the particular fragrance of a garden that had been neglected for months and was now, under my hands, beginning to remember its own structure. Victor had planted these roses the year I was born. Hybrid teas, mostly Mr. Lincoln, a deep red that looked almost black in certain light, and Peace, a yellow-pink blend that opened in slow, deliberate spirals, each petal unfolding like a thought being fully articulated. "Talk," I said. Daniel breathed. The exhale carried static across the line, that particular electronic grain that makes phone conversations feel like two people speaking from inside separate containers. "I've been thinking about what you said in the mediation, about nobody asking you to move home, about making the choice." A pause. "I've been thinking about whether you're right, whether I'm right about what, about everything, about Mom, about the money, about," his voice caught, not the practiced catch of a man deploying vulnerability, but the involuntary snag of a sentence running over broken ground. "About whether I knew what I was doing when I drove her to Hale's office." I waited, emotion the weighted emotion office and second gift. "I think I knew," he said. "Not completely, not like I didn't plan it the way you probably think I did, but I knew she was confused. I knew she was different. And I drove her there anyway because she told me she wanted to change the will. And I didn't ask why. And I didn't ask whether it was fair because asking would have meant hearing an answer I didn't want." The roses swayed in a warm breeze. A bumblebee landed on a mister. Lincoln bloom and began its slow, purposeful excavation, its legs dusted with pollen the color of gold leaf. I watched it work. I let Daniel's words settle the way I let compost settle, slowly, with weight absorbing into the soil of what I already knew. Did she ever say my name? I asked. During the drive, in the office, did she mention me? A long silence. The traffic sounds ebbed. I heard what might have been Daniel swallowing, or might have been the phone shifting against his ear, the small, ambiguous acoustics of a conversation neither of us had rehearsed. She said your name once, he said, in the car. She said Clara will understand. That's what she said. Clara will understand. Clara will understand. I set the phone on the garden wall and looked at the sky. The August blue was so deep it looked manufactured. The kind of blue that only exists in places where the air is clean and the light has nothing to obstruct it. A contrail crossed from east to west, white and deliberate, like a line drawn on a blueprint by a hand that knew exactly where it was going. Clara will understand. My mother's last sentence about me, a Mosin. Not Clara will be fine. The family liturgy, the permission slip they all use to excuse their absence from my life. Not Clara is strong, but Clara will understand, as if she knew, even in her confusion, that I was the one who saw things clearly, the one who read structures, the one who would look at the will and see not what it said, but what it concealed. She had been right. I did understand. I understood everything. I picked the phone back up. Daniel, yes, I understand, I said. And I let the two words carry every meaning they could bear. Forgiveness and accusation and grief and love and the irreducible complexity of a sister who had spent 20 years being invisible and who had finally, through a trial and a verdict and a dead father's filing cabinet, become visible enough to be worth a phone call. I don't know what happens now, he said. His voice was very small. I don't know how to be. I don't know who I am without the performance, I said. Yeah, neither do I said, but I'm going to find out. I hung up. The phone screen went dark against the warm stone of the garden wall. The roses nodded in the breeze, red and gold and pink, their colors deep and specific and alive. I picked up the pruning shears and returned to the work my father had started, cutting at angles so the rainwater would run off, so the stems would heal. The garden was overgrown. The house behind me was half empty, half renovated, its rooms still echoing with the ghost frequencies of the life Margaret had curated and the life Daniel had tried to install over it. But the bones were good. The proportions were true. The foundation, my father's foundation, the one he had built in secret, the one he had trusted me to find, was sound. There was work to do, and I was at last an architect with a project. I found the workshop key on a Tuesday morning in September, hanging from a nail behind the water heater in the basement, exactly where my father would have put something he wanted to survive his wife's curation. The workshop had been locked since Victor's death. Margaret had never entered it. The room existed below the threshold of her domestic consciousness the way a boiler room exists below the consciousness of a hotel guest, essential, invisible, belonging to someone else's jurisdiction. When Victor died, the workshop simply sealed itself, and Margaret, focused on the theater of grief, the management of flowers and condolence cards, and the complex logistics of public mourning, never thought to open it. Neither had Daniel. Why would he? Daniel had never built anything with his hands. The concept of a workshop held as much relevance for him as a language he'd never learned. He could admire the shape of the words without understanding what they meant. The key was small, brass, darkened with age and the particular oxidation that metal develops when exposed to basement humidity for years, a greenish patina that felt rough under my thumb, like a tiny mineralized map of the time it had spent waiting. It turned in the lock with the same knuckle crack sound as the filing cabinet, the same clean, reluctant release, and the door swung open on hinges that had been oiled. Oiled, I realized with a catch in my throat, sometime in the last decade. My father had maintained the hinges on his workshop door even after his stroke. He had dragged himself down to the basement with a can of 3-in-1 oil and lubricated the mechanisms of his own private country. The smell hit me first. Sawdust and linseed oil and the mineral tang of old steel, the olfactory signature of a man who believed that making things was the highest form of speech. It was so dense, so specific, so Victor, that I stood in the doorway for a full minute without moving, breathing him in, the tears running down my face, not from grief, but from the particular, devastating sweetness of encountering someone you thought you'd lost in the exact place they had been most alive. The workshop was orderly. Tools hung on a pegboard behind the workbench, each one outlined in black marker. Victor's inventory system, a method so meticulous it transformed a pegboard into a diagram. Every hammer and chisel and hand plane claiming its silhouette the way a person claims their shadow. The workbench was clean, swept, sanded, its maple surface glowing amber in the light from the single bulb that had somehow survived years without replacement, as if the filament itself had inherited Victor's stubbornness. And on the workbench, centered, deliberate, placed with the precision of a man who wanted the first thing you saw to be the last thing he made, a birdhouse, not just any birdhouse. This one was different from the dozens he had built over the years. The simple, functional boxes with their round entry holes and pitched roofs that he had mounted on posts throughout the garden. This birdhouse was architecture. It was a miniature of the Ashford house itself. The gambrel roof, the dormer windows, the wraparound porch, every detail rendered at 1/20th scale, with joints so tight they looked grown rather than constructed. The clapboard was real cedar, cut to thickness with a precision that made me press my hands against the workbench to steady myself. The windows were actual glass, tiny panes, set in frames milled from single pieces of cherry, glazed with what I later identified as marine-grade epoxy, each one clear enough to see through, and on the underside burned into the wood with a soldering iron in Victor's careful hand. Clara's house. I picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. The paradox of something built with so much care being so impossibly light, as if the precision of its construction had refined away everything that wasn't essential. I turned it in the workshop light and watched the tiny glass panes catch and release the amber glow. Miniature windows in a miniature house built by a man who had spent his life in the shadow of a woman who never looked down. Emotion. I held it against my chest. The cedar was smooth and warm, and it smelled of the same oil my father used on everything, his tools, his hinges, his secrets. A man who maintained things. A man who built. I carried the birdhouse upstairs. I placed it on the kitchen windowsill, the same windowsill where Margaret had kept a row of African violets in ceramic pots arranged by color, the same windowsill where I had once set the glass of water my father drank every morning while he watched the cardinals in the garden. The afternoon light came through the window and illuminated the birdhouse from behind, turning it into a glowing miniature, a tiny, impossible house with perfectly proportioned windows and a cedar roof, and my name burned into its underside by a man who could not say out loud what he could build in silence. I called Elena. I found his workshop, I said. He built me a house. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that was not legal advice, and was not strategic counsel, and was not the voice of an attorney, but the voice of a friend who had witnessed the full, exhausting arc of what it had taken to arrive at this moment. Go home, Clara. Not your apartment. Home. I looked at the birdhouse on the windowsill. Its tiny windows caught the September light and held it, patiently, precisely, the way a good building holds light. Emotion, the way a good father holds love. I was already there, emosen aldersul. The drafting table arrived on a Friday in October, delivered by two men who carried it up the porch stairs with the careful solemnity of pallbearers, except that what they were carrying was not a death but a resurrection. I had ordered it 3 days after the workshop. Not the original, that was gone, sold with the condominium. This was new from an art supply company in New Haven. And when the delivery men set it down in the library, Daniel's gutted, half-renovated library with its bare bookshelves and the flat screen still leaning in its shipping plastic. I asked them to place it by the east window, where the morning light fell clean and unobstructed. They left. I stood in the empty room, the drywall compound smell still faintly present like a wound that hadn't healed, and I looked at the drafting table in its morning light and cried, not from sadness, but from the physical sensation of a limb that has been numb for 17 years suddenly receiving blood. The table was maple. Its surface was smooth and cool under my palms, and when I pressed flat against it, the anchoring gesture, Elena's gesture, my gesture, I could feel the grain beneath my fingertips, the fine parallel lines of growth rings, each representing a year of patient accumulation. Elena had helped me use the career fund, the $75,000 Margaret had set aside for the resumption of my architectural career. The irony was almost architectural. My mother had funded my return to the profession she pressured me to leave. The money paid for the table, licensing renewal courses, software I hadn't used in 17 years but remembered the way a musician remembers scales, in the fingers, in the body. I unrolled the Bridgeport Library blueprint. It covered the entire surface, blue lines sharp against white vellum. I weighted the corners with river stones from Victor's garden, smooth, heavy, the color of wet pavement. Then I picked up a pencil, HB graphite, freshly sharpened, the cedar casing fragrant with the clean, specific scent of possibility. It felt different from courtroom pens, lighter, more responsive, a tool designed not for recording what had happened, but for imagining what could. I drew the Ashford house. Not as it was, but as it could be. The library restored with bookshelves following original proportions. Victor's workshop converted to a studio with south-facing skylights. The kitchen expanded, not Margaret's curated theater, but one with wide counters and open shelving and windows onto the rose garden. I drew for 3 hours. The pencil moved with a fluency I hadn't expected, graphite sliding across vellum like a skater on clean ice, the lines precise and unhesitant, as if the 17-year pause had compressed my skill the way a spring compresses energy. At noon, I set the pencil down. It was good. Not perfect. My technical skills needed recalibration. My hand cramped after 2 hours because the muscles for a drafting pencil differ from those for a sponge or a pill organizer or pruning shears. But the core, spatial intelligence, instinct for proportion, the ability to see a building as it wants to be, was intact. I photographed the drawing. Afternoon light turned the graphite silver. Riverstone shadows fell across the vellum like small, devoted guardians. Elena replied to the image in 11 seconds. "Welcome back, architect." I set the phone on the table. The library was quiet. Victor's birdhouse sat on the windowsill, catching October light through tiny glass panes. The garden was visible through the east windows, roses blooming their last defiant red. The doorbell rang. I walked down the hallway, past the foyer where I had been invisible, past the staircase where Margaret's portrait no longer hung, past the spot where Daniel's loafers had clicked their confidence into the marble. The front door was heavy, solid oak, original to the house, and when I opened it, the hinges sang one clean note, the same note they had sung the day my father taught me how to oil them 2 decades ago, in a lesson I had forgotten I remembered. A woman stood on the porch, Emosen and the porch. Tense early 30s, dark hair in a practical bun, holding a leather portfolio against her chest the way I used to hold mine. Protective, hopeful, the posture of a person bringing their best work to someone whose opinion matters. "Miss Ashford, I'm Rachel Medina." We spoke on the phone about the apprenticeship. The apprenticeship. I had posted the listing 10 days ago on a professional board I hadn't visited in 17 years. The wording had been simple: experienced architect reopening practice, seeking apprentice with structural engineering interest, small firm, meaningful projects, housing renovation focus. I looked at Rachel Medina on my porch, young, nervous, her portfolio clutched like a shield against the possibility of rejection, and I saw myself. Not the self from the funeral, not the invisible one, not the load-bearing infrastructure that held up a family that couldn't see her. The self from before, the architect who used to stand on porches just like this, holding drawings that mattered, waiting for someone to open the door. I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. "I'll show you the workshop." She smiled, a quick, grateful flash, and crossed the threshold into a house that smelled of sawdust and linseed oil and roses and the faint, persistent trace of Chanel No. 5 that would probably never fully leave these walls. I led her down the hallway, past the birdhouse on the windowsill, toward the room where my father had once built things alone and where, starting now, the building would continue, in company, in daylight, in full view. Emotion have or. On a Sunday morning in November, I stood at the kitchen sink of the Ashford house. My house, half mine, entirely mine in all the ways that mattered. And I washed the dishes from the dinner I had cooked the night before for Elena and Rachel, and for the first time since the funeral, for myself. 3 plates, a serving bowl, 4 wine glasses with the particular bell-clear ring of old crystal, Margaret's crystal, the set she had kept in the china cabinet and used only for occasions she deemed worthy, which had never included a Thursday night dinner with 2 women and a bottle of mid-range Pinot Noir from a shop on Elm Street that the owner had recommended with the casual authority of a man who loved what he sold. The water was warm. The soap was the lavender kind I had started buying for myself. Not the discount brand I had used in my apartment above the dry cleaners, the one that smelled of chemical approximation, but real lavender, dried and distilled. The kind that left a fragrance on my hands that I could still smell hours later when I held a pencil or turned a page. A small luxury. The first of several I had begun to allow myself, not as indulgence, but as recognition that a person who has spent 17 years buying the cheapest soap deserves, at some point, to learn what lavender actually smells like. The kitchen was different now. I had redesigned it in September, using Victor's career fund, not a gut renovation, but what architects call a sympathetic restoration, honoring the original bones while allowing the space to breathe. The counters were wider. The shelving was open, no more closed cabinets with doors that hid their contents the way Margaret hid her preferences. The window above the sink looked directly onto the rose garden, and this morning, late November, the first hard frost still a week away, the last of the peace roses were open, their yellow-pink petals curled against the cold air with a stubbornness that felt personal. I washed the plates one at a time. Each one received the same attention, the same careful rotation under the warm stream, the same gentle pressure of the sponge against the ceramic, the same deliberate placement in the drying rack. It was the same motion I had performed 47 times at my mother's funeral, standing alone in this kitchen while the family ate, and Daniel accepted condolences, and nobody thought to ask where Clara was. But this time was different. This time the dishes were mine. The dinner had been mine. E was dedi for e was amos. E was dedi was the anolis on the dot via some adding just the amaregadi bidi and Nigel. The choice to cook roasted chicken with rosemary from the garden, potatoes cut in thick, uneven wedges because I liked them that way, a salad assembled without regard for color coordination, had been mine. And the people who sat at the table had been there not because obligation demanded their presence, but because they wanted to be in the same room with me. Elena had brought wine and a story about a new case, a woman in Westport whose husband had hidden assets in a cryptocurrency wallet, and Elena was learning blockchain forensics with the focused delight of a predator discovering a new ecosystem. Rachel had brought sketches, preliminary drawings for the Holloway renovation, her first project. The lines still tentative, but the proportions true. And I had traced my finger along her elevation drawing and felt the particular satisfaction of watching someone learn to see the way buildings wanted to be. We had laughed, we had eaten, we had stayed at the table until the candles guttered, beeswax tapers I had found in a kitchen drawer, still wrapped in Margaret's tissue paper. Their wicks never lit because Margaret had kept them for an occasion she never identified. I lit them. The warm, honey-sweet smell of burning beeswax filled the kitchen, and the light they cast was golden and alive. Nothing like the flat fluorescent hum that had been the kitchen's default frequency for as long as I could remember. Victor's birdhouse sat on the windowsill, catching the candlelight through its tiny glass panes. It glowed from within, a warm amber, miniature and precise, the way a house looks from the street on a cold evening when the lights are on inside, and you know without seeing that the people in there are safe. I finished the dishes. I dried my hands on a towel, a new towel, thick cotton, the color of sage, and I walked through the house. The library had bookshelves again, not Margaret's color-coded arrangement. I had shelved the books by subject, the way a library should be shelved, each volume in its logical place. The architecture section was longest. Venturi, Khan, Hadid, Taniguchi, and a growing shelf of my own reference materials. The books I had begun to buy again now that buying books was not a luxury but a professional requirement. Victor's workshop was my studio now. The south-facing skylights I had designed were installed, the glass panels catching the last of the evening light and holding it the way good architecture holds light, intentionally with purpose, turning something that arrives for free into something that feels earned. My drafting table stood in the center, its maple surface marked with the first graphite traces of new projects. The Holloway renovation, a community garden pavilion, a pro bono redesign for the women's shelter on Vine Street. Emotion. Rachel's desk was by the window. She had decorated it with a small cactus and a framed photograph of a bridge, the Golden Gate, backlit, its cables catching the sun like 1,000 suspended lines of intent. I had not asked her why she chose a bridge. I already knew. Bridges were the structures that connected things that had been separated. Bridges were the proof that distance is a design problem, not a permanent condition. I walked back to the kitchen. The dishes were done, the counters clean, the candles reduced to amber pools of wax that hardened slowly in the cool air, preserving the moment in miniature, small golden tablets that would hold the shape of this evening long after the evening itself had passed. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the good kind, whole bean, ground fresh, the smell dense and specific and entirely mine, and I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had spread Victor's bank statements, where I had built Elena's spreadsheet, where I had read my father's letters in the small hours of the morning and discovered that I had been loved with the precision of a man who built things that lasted. The morning light came through the window above the sink and fell across my hands, hands that had washed 47 plates alone and 3 plates by choice, hands that had clenched into fists and pressed flat against tables and gripped pruning shears and held dying parents and turned brass keys in old locks and, this morning, held a coffee cup in the kitchen of a house that smelled of lavender soap and beeswax and the last roses of November. Outside, a cardinal landed on the bird feeder Victor had mounted 20 years ago, a simple wooden platform, nothing elaborate, built to last. The bird was red, the roses were fading. The sky was the pale, washed blue of late autumn, the color of something that has been through weather and survived. I drank my coffee, I watched the cardinal, and then I went to work.